Recording in progress.
Janelle, when you start sharing slides, I'll begin the housekeeping.
Okay, well, I think let's go ahead and do that. So give me a second to do a few clicks. All right. Karen, all yours.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Before we dive into today's agenda, we'd like to orient you to a couple of our Zoom protocols. Today's meeting will be supported using closed captioning feature in Zoom. To access the closed captioning feature, please locate the live transcript button at the bottom of your participant panel and then click Show Subtitle. This will allow you to view closed captions in English throughout the entire presentation. If you'd prefer not to have the closed captions at the bottom of your screen, simply do not click Show Subtitle. At any point during today's meeting, you can re-click the button and it will turn off that feature. I'm now going to turn things over to our interpreters to describe how you can listen to this meeting in English, Spanish, and Mandarin.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this meeting. I, Giovanna Wormsbecker, and Diana Orozco will be your interpreters, your Spanish interpreters today. In order to provide language access, this meeting will have simultaneous bidirectional interpretation from English to Spanish and Mandarin. Please note that the translation globe will not appear until after I've read through all language instructions. Therefore, we're asking that everyone joining us for this event, please select your preferred language to facilitate hearing presenters and participants clearly, and to prevent technical glitches or interference occurring among the three languages, the three channels when one is not selected. If you're on a laptop, please locate the icon shaped like a globe at the bottom of your screen. Click on Language Interpretation and then select English. If you are on an iPad or a phone or a similar device, then locate the three-dot menu at the right corner of your screen. Click on Language Interpretation and then select English. When you speak, please do so at a moderate pace because the interpreter is going to be simultaneously interpreting everything you say. Thank you. Buenos días a todos y bienvenidos a esta reunión. Yo, Giovanna Wormsbecker y Diana Orozco seremos sus intérpretes en español. Esta reunión contará con interpretación simultánea bidireccional en inglés y en español y mandarín. El globo de traducción no va a aparecer hasta que se hayan leído todas las instrucciones en todos los idiomas. Por lo tanto, pedimos que todos los presentes seleccionen su idioma preferido para facilitar escuchar a los presentadores y los participantes con claridad, evitando que se produzcan fallas técnicas o interferencias entre los tres canales cuando uno no se selecciona. Si está usando una computadora, verá un icono en la parte inferior de su pantalla a la derecha en forma de globo que dice Interpretación. Haga clic ahí y seleccione Español. Si está utilizando un iPad o teléfono, localice el menú de 3 puntos que aparece arriba a la derecha. Haga clic en Interpretación de idiomas y elija Español. Cuando sea su turno de hablar, por favor recuerde hablar con voz fuerte y clara y a un paso moderado, ya que la intérprete estará interpretando simultáneamente al otro idioma. Now I will turn things over to our Mandarin interpreter. Thank you.
大家早上好，欢迎参加本次的会议。我的名字是亚楠，今天和 Sarah 一起提供普通话的翻译。为了提供语言的服务，本次会议提供有双向的同声传译。我们会从英语翻译为西班牙语和普通话。请注意，在我们读完英文、西班牙语和中文的所有说明之后，翻译频道的地球图案才会出现。为了避免为选择语言频道而导致技术性的故障或干扰，我们要求参加本次会议的每一位听众都请你们从3种语言当中选择您想听的语言，包括英语在内也要选择，以便能够清楚地听到发言者和与会者的声音。如果您使用的是笔记型电脑，等一下会在屏幕底下找到一个地球形状的图标，点击它之后呢，可以进行语言的翻译选择英语或者是普通话，就是 Chinese Mandarin。如果您使用的是 iPad 或是手机或是类似的移动设备，请您在屏幕的右上角找到3点的图标之后，点击语言翻译，然后选择英语或者是普通话，就是 Chinese Mandarin。如果有机会轮到您发言的时候，请您放慢速度，让我们口译员能够同步翻译您所说的所有内容。谢谢。Thank you.
At this time, I've enabled the live transcripts, and I'd like to ask if anyone has any questions regarding interpretation. Seeing none, I'm going to turn on the translation globe. Please be sure to choose a language so that there are no issues with the meeting or listening to the meeting. Karen?
Thank you, Maya. I think I can actually turn things over to Janelle. Oh, Janelle, we can't hear you.
Say, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this, I guess I'll say, first of several extra meetings that we're adding into the schedule as we look ahead to all the work to be done. So Karen and I are once again with you to facilitate today's meeting. We are rejoined by Carlise King from Child Trends, and we're also joined by Wendy Aki, the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, to share with us today. So what we'd like to do to start off today is, last time we met, Carla introduced a visual framework that was based on individual conversations with our group conversations to really summarize in a page all that we have done and what is ahead of us. You provided some input, some updates were made, so we thought we'd start with that. We'll then move into really looking at some of the terms that came up at the last session and spend a few minutes talking about if we can come to some clarity on those definitions, and reviewing the draft outline. So just a quick, we sent that out to you earlier. We just want to go through it and make you aware of what's in there and how we're using it. And then timeline, what is to come in the sessions as we now have a bit more fleshed out on the outline, how that's coming together. And then we'll turn it over to our guest speakers and researchers to share with us their knowledge. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Carla. I'm happy to share a screen so we can pull up the latest version of the framework.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Janelle. Good morning, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for these extra meetings. We took your lead and made sure that we added more meetings to make sure we're covering the recommendations. So you all have seen this already, and just wanted to give a quick overview on some of the updates that were made based on recommendations that many of you lifted up. So first and foremost, there was a lot of input on, the fourth value, workforce-centered supports and policies. We had named this stability and supports, but received language from you all during our last meeting saying we really need to emphasize that the workforce, this needs to be workforce-centered. We need policies that we know the why for the policies, and we want to make sure that it is one of the critical values. So move the bucket to make sure it reflected what you all were lifting up. In addition, the principles, the dark blue circles, rectangles right underneath it, added additional language based on the recommendations you all made. This was called, the first rectangle was equitable and fair funding. We heard loud and clear that we need to rename it. So took the language that you all recommended. And then added the importance of respect for the early care and education field and in all program settings. So made pretty significant changes there based on your feedback. The other feedback that we received was the importance of connecting quality and child outcomes and at least reflecting these two values next to each other. As we look at the visual, we'll continue to think about how to connect those two and have those conversations, but made sure that we included that information based on what you all shared. And then The recommendations we heard really clear. The statute gives us a task as the work group, and that's to create a single reimbursement rate structure. So we want to make sure we're spending time discussing the base, discussing how the base is quality as we define it. So today will be a lot of discussion on what are base variables, what does quality look like, how do we ensure those base variables include equity, and it will be to inform this first sort of elliptical circle under recommendations. For system recommendations, the next circle under number 3, you all shared really clearly that a lot of that information can be information provided in writing. So we will be sharing more information in writing. Examples include the alternative methodology. You all received a document giving an overview of alternative methodology. And then moving on to the sort of elliptical circle, number 3, work group beyond August 2022. You all lifted up some additional discussions that are needed and asked for a timeline of the additional meetings we'll be having and discussions that you think we still need. So we'll share a quick timeline today on that. And it is just a draft timeline. So if you all think that we need either more meetings, less meetings, different discussions, please know it's a draft, but we wanted to proactively present something to you all. And then the pending discussions we moved, and that's what the timeline will have for you of when we could have some of these discussions. So those were the updates based on what we heard from you all last Friday. And we will keep on updating based on additional information that you provide, but wanted to make sure that we were presenting this to you on a regular basis so that as our thinking changes as a work group, or if we have add-ons, that we're capturing that. So let me pause and see if there's any additional input on this, and then we'll move to the outline for the report. So I'll pass it to you, Karen.
Thank you. Thanks, Carla. And Deborah, I see your hand. Please go ahead.
Yes, just in case if I missed it, did we discuss, or was it on here, about the outcome, the provider's outcome? You have the outcome for the child outcome, but the providers, did we discuss that, or was that going to be on here also? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Deborah. We put it under workforce-centered policy supports, and we could add the terminology outcome for that, but that's where we were capturing if we look at rectangle number 2, the supports of the workforce, that reflects the racial, ethnic, linguistic diversity. So we could add outcomes instead of policies, if that's helpful.
What was it? Wasn't helpful. The printing so small.
I'm sorry. I know. For the work group, WestEd has done a really fabulous job of making this a better visual. Maybe we could share it afterwards to show you all because there was a lot of ideas captured. But just, Deborah, you're totally right. There will be an update to this visual.
Great. Thank you.
Donna, I see that you've got some input.
So just again, this is headed in a very, very good direction. I'm really pleased with all the additions that came out of our conversation last week. I had one thought in the quality section, and I don't know how to capture it, but I'll just throw it out there for you all to chew on. I don't know if it fits in boxes or if it's in other text. I think that we've done a lot of work in the state defining quality around teacher qualifications and academic achievement. And I think that it would be important to broaden that to talk about, and we do have this entire child outcomes section, but the quality has to be focused on the experience the child has that recognizes their whole being, whether that is, health, mental health, nutrition, I think about as a Head Start provider, which my agency is, the comprehensive approach that Head Start has to looking at the quality of program. And I just think we need to lift up that quality is more than the qualifications of the teacher and the curriculum. It has to do with all those other factors.
Thanks, Donna.
So Donna, I'm going to say that is a perfect setup for what we're going to really want to focus on today, which is how do we start talking about what the base is as quality? And that it's not, the base plus, but it's base as quality. So the very concept that you're raising will help us, I think, as we have this conversation. So what I'd encourage is let's listen for it as we hear more from Carlise and are introduced to Wendy. But don't forget that, because that's where we hope to spend most of our time today.
Thank you. Jackie, please go ahead with your feedback.
I'm sorry, I'm a little bit late. I'm also the only ones in the West Side offices, so I'm only over here. But in any case, I just wanted to plus one on Donna, and I think I kind of headed there last time. It was just last week, about how do we become more multifaceted in defining quality from a whole child perspective. And so I won't, Donna said it much more eloquently than me, but just wanted to plus one that, and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you. Thank you for the outline, Janelle, of today. So I won't add more.
Thank you. And Madi, you had put something in the chat. Do you just want to quickly recap it verbally? Madi, I'm not sure if you're still muted. Okay, well, let me turn to Eric Sonnenfeld.
I'm here.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me?
You just want to quickly explain verbally your input that you had in the chat?
Sure. So I just wanted to follow up on Donna's comment and make sure that we're all on the same page regarding provider outcomes. So for me, that meant ensuring that the early educator has a well-supported career pathway to continue developing as an early educator professional. And so that would include ongoing supports for training, education, coaching, and that would be incentivized. So similar to what we've had in the past with AB 212 and First 5 CARES signature project. So I just wanted to clarify that that's what we mean by provider outcomes. Before it gets added to the chart, we should be very clear.
Thanks, Madi. Eric, I see you next, and then Lily.
Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. I think today's been a great workforce session, but I want to remind everyone, let's not get distracted by building the roof of this house. We need to deal with the foundation first. That has killed previous quality initiatives in the past. We all talk about the roof or the high jump, and we do not put the rungs into the ladder. So I want to encourage my fellow work group members to make sure it's all about the base. And if we need to buy the rights to that song, I think we need to, because that's where we start. Then we can talk about the roof. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And Lily, your input, please go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Lily Marquez. I just wanted to just add, I know all of this work is very important as, we move forward. Diversity and inclusive, essential and key. So as we're kind of, implementing all these things to benefit the child as well as the provider, which both are equally important, and making sure that their emotionally, physical, academic, and social needs are met, because that's what's going to allow the child to develop properly and thrive in the world. And as there are healthy children, providers are also going to benefit from that as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Lily. Thank all of you for your feedback on this latest iteration of the framework. Carla, anything else?
Yeah, so a few responses for what folks are lifting up. So defining provider outcomes is additional work that we need to do as a work group. And to Janelle's earlier point, terminology really matters. So we will be spending time on that. So additional time is needed for that. Here, Donna and Jackie really clearly the whole child framework being included in quality. It's something you all, many of you have been saying for some time, so we'll make those adjustments. And then to Eric's point about it is all about the base, that's what the work group has been saying. We've got to figure out the base, and that's why that single rate structure is the first piece and what we will be spending time on. And then there is beyond August 2022, and the work group will discuss what pieces go beyond August 2022 because we won't be able to do that. So just wanted to recognize that the work group has been really clear that we've got to figure out the base and the structure, and P5 has been really essential in getting us to use data, and we'll have more of that information. So didn't want to lose that. And then the last point, the base does have quality variables. So there's different components of quality that we've been discussing, and the base will be considered, will be quality based on what many of you have said. When we first shared this visual, the work group was really clear. You're missing that early care and educators are providing quality in the field. So just wanted to emphasize those points. And I'll turn it back to you, Karen.
Okay, thank you, Carla. And I did see Virginia's hand go up. Virginia, before I turn it back to Janelle.
Yeah, I just want to highlight, can folks hear me okay? I was having some technical.
Yes, it's clear. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I missed a couple of things, but I just want to, appreciate the fact that quality and child outcomes are now right next to each other on this graphic, because those are so intricately connected. And as we look at quality, it's looking at things like curriculum, right? But it's also looking at those nurturing interactions. Whole child means looking at the social emotional development and supports with those responsive interactions, which are key, as well as things like early mental health, addressing challenging behaviors, nutritious meals, right? And so we're really happy to see the connection that this revised document is really making between quality and child outcomes from a whole child perspective, and really emphasizing here that it's very multidimensional, and that the responsiveness and quality of those interactions is really important for outcomes. So really highlighting that top box under child outcomes about access to that. And I'm wondering almost if we should even add another box within child outcomes or within quality. Either way, I mean, it could go in either box that really speaks to the quality and responsiveness of the interactions. Because that is one of the things that when we look at the research is so key to get right.
Thanks, Virginia. Appreciate that. Okay, so all this is being noted for the next iteration. And Deborah, I see your hand.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just real quick, so I can just want to say something that's, I don't know. And I really mean no disrespect to anyone here. And I just want to make sure I'm not mishearing anything, or I don't want to feel a certain way. But the truth is, when you feel like you've been in this field and as family daycare providers, early learner in a home base, when you feel like you've been discarded or disrespected, or you just feel like you were removed for such a long time, it's hard at times for me in particular, to stay on certain topics or to hear something and not respond, because it's real to me, and it's important to keep things at the forefront. And I respect you, Eric, in building the base, and that base needs to be built and it needs to be strong. But at times it is hard sometimes for me not to say certain things, because I don't want providers again to be in the background. I want our presence to be felt here. I want us to be heard here. This is powerful for us. And this is important for us. So sometimes, yes, I might go a little bit off of the topic, but that's my heart speaking. That's what it is. For us providers that's out here working and doing this work the way we're doing it, as hard as we've been doing it, to have an opportunity to make such a change means the world to me. It really does. This is so important. So yes, sometimes I do. But that's just my passion, my concern, my experience, my thoughts, my conversation, the reality that what providers have been doing and how important this is. This is so important in every way to providers. And it's in my heart. So I just need to say that. Just bear with me, be patient with me, but it's my heart. Provider's heart. It's not just one individual. But when I bleed and when I speak, I bleed and speak on behalf of the providers for the state of California, for the nation, making changes, bringing the reality of what we do every single day. So there's no questions, there's no assumptions that people that make decisions know, really know 101 what this workforce is all about doing and will continue to do and have continued to do, even when we felt like no one was behind us. We continue and we will continue. And I'm happy and I'm proud to have the support that we have from the state and from this group. So that's my heart. So I'm gonna say thank you for always being open to hearing what I have to say. That also means the world to me. And no, not feeling discounted at all. I don't want anyone to feel that thinks I feel that way. But thank you. I just want to say thank you. Thank you,
Deborah. Hear your heart loud and clear. Thank you very much. Almost need like a pause, but we shall move on. So much to cover. So Janelle, I should turn it back to you.
Yeah, so thanks everyone for those comments, particularly Deborah. I think you're reminding us all that this is, I look at this script and go, the collective wisdom and, I think care and passion for this is why you're here. And so, Karen and I are just here to try to remind everyone we're on the roadway. And so just appreciate you letting us be on this journey with you. I just want to quickly share a few things in follow up to what Carla mentioned, just so that you're aware of what was also sent out and has been posted. So Carla mentioned that there is the report outline that was shared, and this is really meant to just give a sense of, based on what the statute says for this group, what the law says the group is to do, how we imagine putting together into writing, the very good ideas that we're hearing, the things that you're seeing as we move through meetings. So just a sense of the vision graphic that you're seeing this create really is a prominent part of this report and setting it up, making sure that there is a clarity of what the purpose is. So where we are with regard to what the law requires, what's been the history behind this, what are foundational pieces, and then vision and guiding principles, which come out of that framework. And so we're going to keep revisiting this each time and refine that so that we can make sure that that is really, as it's appearing, the words, the definitions, the ways that's being conveyed are being agreed upon by this group. We have mapped out some areas that are ways to organize the recommendations, again, based on the purpose statute for this group. We heard last week from Carlise, and we'll hear more today about equity. That's a really prominent part of this. And and then getting to what does it mean to have a single reimbursement rate structure? What are the related policies to that? So we have a number of things. Again, these echo the areas that are in the vision and guiding principles. And then things that you have all noted or talked about that really are related but extend beyond our specific work here. So we will continue to look at what needs to go into that area. Providing then, as the statute calls for, some assessment of the state methodology for rates. So this gets to what's the background, where have we been? A lot of this has been covered already in the rate reform white paper that was done. We will be drawing from existing information to compile this. The conversations that we're having about what you see broken with the current system. So a key example here is moving from a model that is what people pay to what it costs is a significant part of the assessment of the reimbursement methodology. How and what that means with respect to program standards, how we think about quality. And this is all in the conversation that we've been having and will continue to have. How and what it means with regard to compensation. So this is provider need. We're going to start that conversation. And as has been noted, what does it mean for positive learning and developmental outcomes for children? So again, we're in that conversation right now, and we'll continue to work through that. We have been hearing from P5. They're here again. We'll close today's meeting with reminders about alternative methodology, thinking about the cost model. As I said earlier, today's meeting is all built around the definition of the base. And we won't finish it, but it's something that we're going to build forward from as we move through this meeting to future meetings. And then at our June meeting, we're going to have the Advancement Project talk to us about what they've collected with regard to parent and voices, and we'll be able to incorporate that into the report as well. And there could be more things that you call out as being useful that you want to make sure that are provided. And we've put in a couple of pieces here that we said have come up or we know are probably needed and flag those for appendix items. So our hope is that this report is brief but mighty. And so there has been a lot that you've already shared, and I think begins the population of these details, but one that we'll revisit with you as we move through our future meetings. So speaking of future meetings, Carla also mentioned that we have an updated timeline that was shared with you, and this includes the meeting that we have today. And so this is what we're going through on our meeting here. We are between meetings, planning to pull together more research, that'll contribute to the assessment, contribute to the areas that we've identified in the outline. We are looking for feedback, and then we'll be bringing those things into this group as what we hope can be pieces of information, just like you're seeing the vision framework, and continue to work on that. So our next then meeting would be June 10th. You can see we have a number of topics slated for that meeting that really will contribute to the substance of the report, followed by a June 17th meeting. This is one that we are proposing to, I think, add in, and the June 10th we're proposing to add in, and then also adding in a June 24th meeting. And this is because we think this is going to be necessary so that we can bring draft reports or versions of it that will then help us come to the place where in July we're bringing what we consider to be the third draft, and then a work towards a finalized draft. And you can see the detailed timelines of things that would go into that report so that we can finalize and meet the August 15th deadline by having the report on August 12th. So you can see here we're proposing a few additional meetings. We are also proposing that these all occur via Zoom to facilitate. We may see what conditions allow and if it's possible to get people together for the final meeting in person. But at this point, we're seeing, just for the numbers of meetings, probably keeping this as flexible as possible. We will always have a space available in Sacramento for those that wish to come in person. So that's what we've outlined. I see a hand from Eric Peterson.
Morning, everybody. So I saw, I think on June 24th that we're going to talk about the single rate system again. And right now during budget time, I'm sure many of you can chime in on this. we are really struggling as a field with the rate systems. Our regional market rate implementation over to that we're using for Title V centers now, it's causing us all kinds of problems. Inequities, it's a real issue for us. So if we're going to go to a single rate system, I just want to make sure that we keep in mind that the way center-based programs get paid and alternative payment programs get paid are vastly different, and it has to encompass both of them. And I think the work group may have to point out some of the regulations that would be a barrier to that. So I just want to make sure that I say that out loud before I forget. And thank you all.
Thanks, Eric. That is certainly on the list of the to-dos that we have to work on. So we will, and I think Carlise may even have some comments about that today. Any other comments before I do turn this over? We turn over to public comment and then transition to our experts for the day. Okay, well, Karen, I'm going to turn it back to you to describe how we're doing public comment today, and then I'll take it back over and introduce our experts.
Thanks, Janelle. And just as you did that, Verlinda, your hand went up. Did you want to make a quick comment?
Yes, everyone. Good morning. My little piece here. I'm trying to hold back the tears because Deborah's speech was very powerful. The work that we do here as family FCCs, which you guys don't see the lives, and you're asking to implement how we can make this system better. We're no different than the families we serve. We live in the same neighborhoods that they live in. We go through the same traumas as they go through. But we have not wavered, we have not waved away, we have not humbled in our position to make sure that we provide quality care to these children, because there was a need. These children was not being thought about, and we stepped up to the plate, and we're still stepped up to the plate. When the system closed down during COVID, we kept our doors open. We lost family members. We did not have time to even to put our feelings aside and grieve. We had to keep our doors open to make sure this state of California and the whole United States to continue to work. So our work is viable. And the only thing we're asking is to get the same piece of the pie or the same quarter as everyone else, so we can continue to strive and continue to give this quality service and continue to be respected in the field that we are doing, to make sure that our generation of children, from the next generation of children, will not be left alone or left in the gap or not with the skills that they need. Yes, we do need a foundation. That's why we're here. We want the foundation. We want a sturdy side. We want a sturdy top. We want a sturdy everything, but we want everybody in this field to be respected, to get the same quality pay, the same benefits, and everything else. It should not matter if we're at the beginning of the train or the middle of the train. Our goal is to make sure that these children, these innocent children who did not ask to be born, who did not ask to be here, to get the education and the care that they need and the foundation, so they can continue on to grow as young adults, to be able to be presidents and be in the seats where we're at today or where you're at today. But in order for us to do this, we need to all come together as one and fix this system. I thank you for saying that this morning.
Thank you so much.
So Karen, before you turn this over to public comment, and thanks, Verlinda, for that reminder. Again, this is, I think, the humbling nature of this work is that we're doing this on behalf of people that are hardworking and children that have great needs and families that depend upon our child care workforce professionals. So But before, I just want to, I want to remind a few things to call out in the dates that I didn't do when I went through it, which is there's the dates that you have for meetings have a few changes that I just want to note. So one of them is that we moved the original meeting from the 8th of July to the 6th of July. So there's a shift in that schedule. We'll make sure that everyone has updated appointments for that. And then we moved the start time of the June 17th meeting to start at 9 a.m. and we'll go to noon. So just a few things to call out. Again, we'll send this out so everyone has the updated dates and times, but those are two changes that have been made, one with the start time shifting back and the end time as well on the 17th of June, and then moving from July 8th to July 6th. So again, we'll send out some reminders and some of that schedule. So Karen, all yours for public comment reminders.
Yes, thank you so much. So this is our first public comment period. We'll be opening the chat feature for the next 5 minutes for all attendees to provide written comment for the public record. We'll have this opportunity again at the end of the meeting, as well as verbal public comment at the end of the meeting. So we've opened up the chat feature, and I think now I'm really turning it back over to Carlise. Janelle, any words before?
Yeah, let me just say a few things before we turn this to Carlise, and that is to one, thank Carlise for rejoining us. I think everyone left with great inspiration and new thinking as a result of our time with Carlise. So we're glad that she could be here today to provide her expertise and to continue our discussion about equity and standards, and then to introduce into that discussion targeted universalism with Wendy Aki, the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, joining us. So I'm excited to have you both here. What we're going to do for this next segment is we're going to hear from Carlise for about 30 minutes. Then we're going to turn it over to Wendy. We'll have them both join us for a few questions, then we'll take a break. So that's our plan probably for the next little bit more than an hour here. So with that, Carlise, welcome back and looking forward to hearing from you, and I will be sharing your slides.
Great, thank you, Janelle.
Okay, I will be, here they go, okay.
You can go to the next slide. So good morning, everyone. As I mentioned before, my name is Carlise, and I serve as the Executive Director for the Early Childhood Data Collaborative at Child Trends. I just want to thank you guys for welcoming me back for another conversation about how to embed equity into your current efforts to develop a unified rate structure. The Early Childhood Data Collaborative is committed to helping state policymakers and practitioners use data to advance equitable policies, as well as combat racial inequities in early care and education systems. As I mentioned on our last call, I started in the field conducting the California regional market rates, so it really feels like coming full circle to be having this conversation with you today, 20 years later. But I do want to underscore that equity is not a one-time task, it's ongoing. So my hope is for this conversation, that this conversation today is one of many that you will have as you advance your work. Next slide. So my objectives for this follow-up conversation is to briefly touch on what it means for California to shift its methodology for developing payment rates from price to cost. And Eric touched on briefly some of the repercussions of some of the changes you've already made, but just to ground our initial conversation and what that means. Second, I wanted to have us think about the current variables that are included in different program standards, what variables may be missing related to equity and quality, and what variables are important to have as part of cost estimates for a base rate that supports programs to provide ongoing quality. Last is to think about what factors might go into the base rate or adjustment factors to incentivize different types of care and needs that communities may have. Again, just listening to Janelle and Karen talk about that all you have to do. I know it's a lot, but my goal is that you can hopefully use this information and take it into your next conversation about targeted universalism to further think through how policies can be targeted to those programs and families that are currently the furthest from opportunities. Next slide. So first, I want to walk to walk through how a cost model to inform payment rates is different and the implications. And I know you guys have talked about this a little. I'm not going to go into detail, but it's mainly just to kind of refresh before we sort of talk about ways to embed equity in a new cost model. So price refers to fees charged to parents and corresponds to the amount paid by families, while cost refers to the value of the resources needed to provide childcare services and corresponds to the amount paid by providers to offer those services. For a long time, California has had two different systems for reimbursing care that is subsidized by the state, neither of which explicitly took into consideration the personnel and non-personnel costs needed to meet specific health and safety requirements, recruit and retain qualified staff, or to deliver care that meets children's developmental needs. So moving forward, to drive equity, payment rates will need to reflect the costs that support high quality care to communities with the greatest needs. Next slide. I wanted to introduce two new concepts today from a national report that was developed by the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation that outlines considerations for evaluating payment processes and rates specific to equity. Please keep in mind that these are equity concepts that are typically used in economic theories rather than the racial justice definitions that I provided previously. And they're really meant in thinking about how you evaluate your methodologies, but not necessarily as a goal. So first is horizontal equity, in which where similar childcare services receive the same compensation. In this instance, you may ask yourself, in developing your methodology, do providers offering similar services receive the same amount? For example, we know in the previous systems, you could have a provider that was offering the same quality of care to the same age of a child in the same community, but depending on the funding source, they may receive a different amount based on the state reimbursement rate versus the regional market rate. In this instance, this is an instance where the difference in compensation is not related to the services that are provided. One issue with horizontal equity is that it assumes that programs have access to the same resources, which we know is not the case based on past research. So while you might start with this approach to develop a base rate for programs, you don't want to stop there. Vertical equity, on the other hand, refers to the distribution of resources or funds according to the needs, so that those with more resources receive less and those with less opportunity and resources receive more. It's intended that rates vary to target specific needs of families and providers. This concept is similar to targeted universalism, which you will dive into more, but is absent of the universal goal that is desired for all providers and families. So moving forward, I know you're going to be thinking about how, in designing a single rate structure that supports quality standards that are equitable and supporting children's positive learning and developmental outcomes. So it's thinking about how do we connect these goals of equity to an overall goal and then target strategies to achieve that goal. Next slide. So before going into a conversation about cost estimates, I want to pivot for a minute and think about cost to do what. So next, I will share some examples of current program variables to start thinking about which program standards need to be accounted for and aligned with a new rate structure. These are not recommendations, and you will see throughout there are opportunities for your input. It's meant as a starting point to begin thinking about how a cost model could align with specific standards to make sure that programs are being supported in the ways that they need to do their work. Next slide. So I want to thank West Ed for helping with this summary design. This table is a high-level summary of the materials that were shared with the work group last week, outlining different types of care designations and program requirements. So as you can see, there are different requirements for different types of care currently. Looking down the table, you see family, friend, and neighbor, licensed family child care homes and licensed centers, center and home-based programs that are contracted with the state, such as state preschool programs, and then Head Start programs that have direct federal contracts in the way that they're funded, and then QCC, which is the Quality Care Counts program standards. As you can see in the first column, there are health and safety standards requirements for all settings. As you move to the right of the table, you will see more variation in the dots for staff education, ratios, curriculum, child assessment, interactions, and child partnerships. On the next slide, we move into program standards that are less common across settings. In this table, you see program goals that are related to mental health supports, developmental screening, and nutrition. And I know part of your role is thinking, are there other standards that need to be supported here that are not reflected? And I think there were some comments earlier to that effect. And then on the next slide. And then on this last slide, you see variables that are not currently included in any type of setting, such as paid professional development time and cultural and linguistic competencies, which are variables that have been identified as being important to equity, but aren't necessarily or may not be part of current standards for programs. So I guess I want to pause here and in thinking about the information that I've shared, are there other variables that should be considered before we talk about cost considerations that are needed for programs to comfortably meet any given standard? So I'm going to pause here to see if people have any questions or comments.
Yeah, and I see right away Robin has her hand up.
Good morning. Could you go back to the slide that says that shows standard variables? Maybe it was one more. That one. So where it says CSPP / fetching, that would also, I would recommend putting the CCTR, that's another state contract for the infants and toddlers. And then I would just believe that those state contracts deserve a green dot under interactions. That would be my recommendation, if that's what you were asking for. Were you asking for edits or?
No, I think it was mainly, no, and that's fine. And I think we want to make sure that this is accurately reflecting. This is meant to be a summary of the standards document that the work groups last week. It's more in thinking about the categories that are going across the top. So currently we have different standards and variables for different programs, but in thinking about developing a base rate, like what sort of program standards need to be supported, right, in a base rate. It could be all these same ones, and it could vary, or are there other ones that are missing, or some here that maybe you wouldn't include?
So that's what I would say is missing, the green dot under interactions for the state funded programs. That is a requirement.
And I think, Carlise, if I'm following you, it's really thinking about in terms of what you wish for, what you think is appropriate in terms of standards, types of variables to be considering, whether there's any additional.
Exactly. Like how, what is important to sort of build into the base?
Yeah. And Eric, I see a hand, so you may have a thought on this.
This is a hard standard to put in a column or quantify, but I think we have to quantify necessity, meaning that this is a piece of infrastructure, right? So you build a road for that last person 5 miles off the freeway. There's not a column to try to account for that need. It's not a quality program standard, it's a necessity standard. So I think when we talk about the base, and yes, these are the things as we build to the roof, the base has to incorporate that necessity factor. What does that, to include that? And I don't have a good column heading to call that other than necessity. If you want infrastructure to be alive and well throughout the entire state of California, that is a very important piece of the system. Having all these other things is great, but if you don't have the first necessity that there's access, we're just wasting everybody's time.
Thanks, Eric. Deborah, you have thoughts on what we should be considering here?
Yes, thank you. I just need to understand, what do you mean when you say family partnerships? because I don't see a dot for family childcare. And I think, okay, well, exactly what is family partnerships along with interactions, from my point of view, so I just need to understand that, if you can, Carlise.
So maybe, Deborah, let me take a attempt at this, since what we did at WestEd was based on the request that came in March, was a little bit more background information about what programs require. So you'll see this is the summary that we created. There's much more detail that was also provided, but this is directly related to formal program standards. So the reason we're introducing this, or thought it would be helpful to introduce, is the current programs have certain requirements. And so as we move from a price to a cost-driven model, part of it is what are the factors that contribute to cost? And one of them that you could see is, well, if I have to do it, it must be, something we need to think about. So let's, I think so we can, I can see where you could say, well, some of these things actually we do. And I would say that in the formal sense, that's where we want to go in this conversation. We know there are things that are done that may exceed these base standards, in which case, how do we start to think about that in the context of the model to come? So that's where I'd kind of would say, let's position this as a point of reference as to what the current reality of the minimum standards are. I'm already hearing people comment about things that you'd like to see addressed perhaps or recognized as we move forward. So let's hold on that so that we can have that discussion when we talk about the base rate specifically. So I'm seeing a couple hands come up, and Deborah, I hope I answered your comment there.
And Janelle, and forgive me, I do see hands, but I also hearing you say, there's time later for certain parts of the discussion. So if you were to sort of restate what we would hope to hear right now, maybe you can just clarify that for us.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing Carlise say, and Carlise certainly chime in here, is this is really what exists today in terms of at a very high level, what program standards require and where we see these requirements being both similar and where we see them being different. So right now we could say the one requirement that's similar across all programs are health and safety. Beyond that, the programs have different structures in terms of where they fall with what the ratios are and whether they reference ratios, whether or not there's a formality to the assessment. It doesn't mean this is not happening in other places. So what I think Carlise is calling out, are there column headers? Are there things that you would all look at and go, wait, we're missing something that really matters? And again, this isn't our last bite at this apple. We get a whole orchard of this today and beyond. We're going to have P5 come back at the end and talk to us more about, components of cost drivers and base rates and the methodology. So but to give you again a point of reference, these are things that are formally captured in our current program standards. And I see Mari has put in NAEYC accreditation. That's something, again, we could add a column and say, where does that sit and how should that apply if we decide things like that? So that's really what we wanted to give you, is this isn't a overly simplified, but we took out a lot of complexity so we could give it as a point of reference, how things work today. And again, as you move from price to cost, these are the kind of things then that become real factors. So in looking at where these dots go, there would be differences that we acknowledge. If these are then not the same across programs, there are then some potential for differences in cost. So that's
absolutely, Janelle. And I would just kind of add, a part of it is to clarify that previously the estimates and the payment rates weren't connected to any of these requirements or standards. So it's kind of thinking about, as we move forward, we want to be mindful of what the current standards are, but also thinking about what goes in the base and then what might go into something that's more of an adjustment factor. So Mari, I think your example, if you take Minnesota, they have a base rate that they provide everyone, but there's a 20% increase for those that are accredited. So that's something that doesn't go into their base rate. It's something that's used in more of the vertical, where those that meet that accreditation, there's an increase to the base that they receive. So again, not to make decisions now, but I think we didn't want to move you into the conversation about costs and the base estimates. Instead of thinking about it, it's sort of cost estimates in service of what exactly, and kind of making sure that we're thinking about that in an ongoing way.
Thank you, Carlise. Yeah, it's really helpful. Okay, and some hands now that are ready to provide feedback on this. Virginia, I see yours first.
Thanks, everyone. So I think what it seems like a lot of people are flagging is that it might be helpful to have like a slide that bullets out each of these buckets with definitions of each of them, so we sort of know what we're talking about. And I think that would help us moving forward for our discussion. In terms of overall buckets, I'm making some assumptions right now about what's included in them. I see curriculum, I see cultural, linguistic competence, responsiveness. So I'm sort of, it's hard to say for sure if some of the things that we're thinking about are in each of the buckets, which is where the definitions would help. But I did want to highlight the need to capture inclusion for children with disabilities here. That is definitely something that, and doing inclusion well, having children with disabilities in classrooms or settings with other typically developing children, and then providing that, whether it's for children with disabilities or children without, making sure there's that differentiated instruction that will help every child in that setting succeed. And then also, and this is where I'm not sure if this is included under cultural, linguistic competence, responsiveness, but making sure that supports for dual language learners are more explicit. So, is that a bilingual program model? Is that building into the rate where teachers that are bilingual are receiving more money or something? Like, how are we building those two elements into both our way of thinking about quality and then how we're paying programs?
So Virginia, those are great comments, and a good point for me to remind everyone that exactly what you asked for, which is the further detail and the breakdowns of these that go on pages, were also shared. So what we're just showing you right now, and thank you, Carlise, for taking this on, was just an overview so that we could have this kind of conversation and give you a sense of what you might explore more as you look at that background material and where we need to bring some of those details into this discussion. So I think in a prior meeting, Eric had already made the comment about inclusion and thinking about children with disabilities. So thank you for raising that again. We've had several conversations about linguistic, dual language learner needs. And again, that's, I think, something that we would note is important. I think we've even had some sharing of some specific examples of needs for home-based family child care educators to be bringing in translators or pursuing some supports in that regard. So I think these are perfect examples of things that right now are not recognized in standards and may be things that we need to look at as we continue to think about what's in the base rate. So thanks for elevating that and just the reminder, and we'll put the link in that of where those resources can be found on the page. So back to you, Karen, to move through our conversation.
Thanks, Janelle. Okay, Donna, I see your hand next. Please go ahead.
And second on Virginia, I do think that there are areas where we already have rate factors that identify some of those things, and we want to carry that thread through. The other thing that I wanted to specifically add is the chart itself identifies what we currently measure, not what's currently offered. Many of our family child care providers and private centers tick off a lot of those boxes, but we don't measure it. And as we move into making this how we pay people, we're going to have to pay people on what we can consistently measure. Because otherwise we are setting up a whole bunch of other inequities. And either we're going to have to be able to measure and account for all of these things for everyone, or we're going to have to scale back what we count. But it's not fair to pull out. Truly, we run Head Start programs, we have state preschool, and we do those things. But I know there are community-based family childcare providers and centers who do the same thing, but we don't measure it. And to say we're going to pay more on things that they're doing, but we're not measuring is not fair. So I just want to make sure that we're very clear about the difference between what people are actually providing versus what we're measuring and how we're going to rectify and settle that up.
So Donna, what I'm hearing you say, and this is using something Carlise just said about getting to vertical equity, horizontal equity. When things are the same, how do you ensure you pay the same? Part of what you're pointing out, it's not just the commitment to pay, it's actually the structures to collect the data, to measure, to be able to respond and recognize the sameness. So appreciate that comment.
And right now we pay based on what we measure.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of people offering a lot more than what we say because we don't measure it. So we've got to fix that.
Thank you, Donna. Jackie, love to hear your input. You're still muted, Jackie.
Sorry, so going third, I feel like I have plus one, right? And so I think early care environments are important. So for example, what do we mean by health and safety? ERS, for example, measures things like activities for children and materials. And I would kind of add another layer if we're thinking about equity, culturally responsive, culturally appropriate materials in that kind of thinking, if you will. And then also plus one for inclusion on developmental screenings, right? Developmental and health screenings that we know a lot of our providers are doing right now. And Janelle, I know that this was high level, so it's probably in the definitions. So I apologize if that's already been accounted for. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Jackie. Robin.
Thank you. I'll say to that and everyone else here, never assume. So please say it because it's going to be helpful.
Exactly. All right, Robin, please go ahead.
Thank you for letting me speak again. So I just want to go back to the dot chart. CSP, if the chart is about what is regulated, for CSPP and CCTR, interactions are regulated. So I strongly suggest we put a dot. The other thing I want to caution us is when we're starting to go, it's starting to feel like we need to do this or add more. So I just want to remind everybody that what we see on these charts is what we do today in all of these different sectors. And we need to get a higher rate for what we're doing now. I don't want us to add dots and then say, okay, now we'll pay you. Just want to be really careful here. We're kind of crossing the line of let's increase the dots. And what Donna was saying is correct. Like we have to be able, if we increase and we have to be able to measure it, but I don't want to do that. I think this group is very adamant that the work we're doing today requires a higher rate.
So Robin, can I summarize that in a way to say dots equal dollars? I mean, I think this is where the big shift of going from price to cost is that we have not recognized or reflected in the modeling of this that each of these dots have a dollar with them.
Correct. And so, yeah, that is correct. But I want to be clear that when we're looking at the FFN and FCC, that even though they don't have as many dots as say Head Start, that their rates need to go up. That base rate needs to go up for what they're doing now.
And they may be offering some of these things and we're just not counting it.
And that would be where we would have possibly sometime in the future, the like what we have now, the rating system. But I don't want to do that now because we still don't have the correct base rate for what we're doing now.
Thanks, Robin. Virginia, you have more to say here. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to what Donna said about making sure that there's equity in measurement for whatever we pick. I think that's a really important point because as we look to child outcomes and as we make sure that the things we have in our programs are the most tied with the research, and as we look across our entire system and how we're supporting children and the teacher and provider workforce that supports them, and making sure there's enough money for those pieces, we have to make sure, and we would definitely want to make sure that there were enough resources at the state and regional levels to measure those quality indicators and then provide embedded and coaching on them so that everyone would be supported as part of it. So I'm hoping that as part of the work we do together, we can think through what that would look like and how we can get there and what it might cost so that we have more to work from going forward.
Thanks, Virginia. And Madi, you wanted to say something. Please go ahead.
Good morning again. So I've made several comments in the chat, and so I just want to make sure to verbalize them since not all participants can view. But I think one of the important points I wanted to bring up is, starting at community care licensing. That is the base, that is the minimum, that is what is required to actually operate childcare. And so we need to figure out, starting from there, what a base could look like, and then think critically about what measures of quality in addition we would add to that and use existing systems that are in place, like the child development permit. So I think it can be a little bit dangerous to our work to start throwing out measures like supporting dual language learners, because as I've pointed out in the chat, that would need to be measured. And someone that is actually a native speaker, bilingual, and using their language to support the child across the day, and are also culturally and linguistically and ethnically similar to the child, may not get the, in quotes, credit for supporting a child who is a dual language learner based on what the research tells us is the best, someone that looks and speaks like them and shares the same background. And a monolingual speaker who has had a privilege and worked for a center-based program and completed multiple trainings would meet that requirement through a course or a certificate. And so that's just one example of what I'm trying to demonstrate, that when we do want to ensure that we're supporting all children, particularly a large amount of children whose home language is not English. But when you set up a system of measurement, the default of any group is going to say, well, what tool do we have to measure that? And often we're not going to say, just by your mere presence of looking and speaking like the child, you meet that requirement. Okay, it's going to be something else like seal of biliteracy that our current workforce doesn't have. So all I'm trying to say is, let's get back to the base of what we have in place is the licensing, and start from there, because I get really concerned. And to Deborah's point earlier, it's like we're layering on more and more quality that we wish would be in place. And we're getting away from where we started, which is we had way too many childcare programs closed during the pandemic. We have way too many programs that are at risk of closing now. And when we connect our rates to ideal measures, that's not going to fix the problem that I believe we're at this work group to help solve, which is what is the baseline to stay open, and then the dotted lines to all other resources that we have to support the provider and the program to engage in ongoing quality improvement and professional development. Thank you.
Thanks, Madi. And Verlinda, I see your hand. So before I invite you to speak, just food for thought as we move forward in this next few minutes. You saw these dots. We talked about dots equals dollars and appreciating all of that. So I think another way to frame this question is, are there dots you see now that should not be included in the base? So kind of giving an existing program variables, standard variables. As you look at those, are there some that you want to bring to the group for consideration as those variables that should not be included in the base? So give some thought to that. I want to turn it back to Verlinda, and then I know also Carlise needs a few more minutes too. So Verlinda, please go ahead.
Hello, good morning. I want, I guess, more clarification on the measuring system. Is the measuring system consist of class, ASQs, DRDPs, is that what's the system is you're talking about measuring where you're getting the price, they're being measured and being priced on, or what? Can you clarify that for me and the other providers in education?
So Verlinda, great question, and one that I think those are certainly things we have in place now. I don't think when we talk about measurement, we're saying that those would be the tools to use, but if there's a recognition that we need some measurement tools, I think that would be appropriate for the work group to call out, and how we do measurement would be something that happens subsequent to the work group's scope or time to do this. I hope others agree, but I think if we started taking that on, we would have to meet every day for a couple hours.
Thank you. Thanks for your question, Verlinda. So question here, Janelle, should we ask Carlise to finish, give Carlise a chance to finish up and then bring it back to this question of any dots that we think should not be in the base, or how would you like to sequence that?
Yeah, so why don't we bring it back to Carlise to wrap up? And then what I'd actually like to do is table where the dots may disappear or be added for when we have Carlise and Wendy join us back for some group conversation. But I think that really is the question. If we're moving from price to cost, the dots equal dollars. So what should the dots be? Like, or what would you add? What would you take out? So that's really the question that I think several people articulated. Let's not ask for things that we're not ready to pay for. And I think that is something we want to be mindful as we move through the system. So Carlise, we'll turn it back to you and I'll share back out the slides.
Great. And thank you guys all for your great thoughts and comments. I think that was exactly, like, now that we've been thinking about the different types of programs standards that could go in the base, I wanted to go through kind of cost considerations, thinking about to support high quality care, and what the process is going to be, like what goes into the base versus what goes into sort of factors that are meant to support those with fewer resources and less opportunity to get there. So next slide. So what I'm going to do is that I previously had questions on each of these slides. What I'm going to do is walk through each of these slides and then maybe move into kind of broader final comments and thoughts. So thinking about the current standards we've reviewed and thinking about the work group's goal to develop recommendations for a base, what resources are needed to support programs to provide ongoing quality? So regardless of what the standards are, there are certain things that any program is going to need in order to implement those. So are there other inputs that are needed to be considered beyond personnel, their ongoing professional development, program materials, food, administration, child assessment, transportation, or family engagement? And then applying the equity definition I shared from our last call, what are the ways we can involve families and providers in this decision-making process? As you're embarking on this new methodology, it will be so important, as was noted, to create processes for ongoing assessment of the methodology, as well as monitoring its implementation. Next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, we know that the base will not be enough for all providers because they're not all starting in the same place. So how might we vary the base to support different types of care or programs situated in different communities? So for example, an adjustment factor needed for care in rural communities where there are fewer options for care, and families need to travel longer distances to access care, or in communities with higher poverty rates where families have less capacity to pay the full cost of care. And then again, how will you involve families and providers in what this looks like? So you guys have already gotten into some of these questions and thinking about like what is in the base, and then what, maybe how do we target rates for different types of care in order to, I think what Eric was doing, build the infrastructure that we need, and really thinking about where are things not the same across programs, where are additional supports needed, and how do you build that into the process? So thank you. Those were all of mine. I don't know if you want to have more conversation, Janelle, move on to the targeted universal conversation and then come back. Just let me know.
Let's do this, Carlise. I know we're running a little behind, but I think this is exactly the kind of conversation we were hoping the group would have. I think Wendy's still with us. I want to just confirm if Wendy has a hard stop time. So Wendy, are you here with us for the duration, or do you need to end by a particular time?
Oh, I'm here for the duration. Thank you.
Okay. Well, then I'm wondering, this actually may be a good time for us to take a brief break and to come back at 10 o'clock. And then we come back at 10 o'clock, we'll turn it to Wendy and she can introduce us to the research that she's been involved in with regard to target universalism. And then we can have it about 10:30. Carlise and Wendy can both rejoin us for a few minutes and we can have some discussion about the implications and on the base rate based on what they both shared. And from there, we'll move into further discussion with P5, bringing us back to the cost drivers and other factors related to the alternate methodology. So if that works for everyone, let's take a break. And if you could, we'll stay in this room. So if you just, you can mute, you can turn off cameras and or rejoin us in a bit. So see you at 10 o'clock.
Okay, it is 10 a.m. Pacific time, so we'd like to reconvene now. Appreciating having your cameras back on if you're able, just so we know you're back with us. Thank you so much. Okay, wonderful. Well, Janelle, are any particular introductions before we let Wendy begin?
No, I think, Wendy, feel free to make further introductions, but we're delighted to have you and really appreciate you making time to join the group. I guess I'll just make an ad here, which is Wendy's going to bring to us her expertise on target universalism, which was part of resources that were offered through the Institute with the Blue Ribbon Commission. So there's a real connection to prior work. Also, Wendy has in her background finance reform. So we're delighted to have somebody that can help us knit the various topics that we're addressing in this. And Wendy, I really appreciate you making time. So all yours, Wendy.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. And it has been great to see the Blue Ribbon Commission reports that have come out. And interesting to you, but also really practical, action-oriented parts of TU. I will screen share now. Hopefully this will go without complication. There we go. Okay, does that look good?
Looks great.
Okay, great. And everyone can hear volume well?
You sound good to me, Wendy, yeah.
Okay, awesome, thank you. So wanted today to talk about targeted universalism and how we use the term and the way it's connected to an action plan to operationalize and put on the ground what we talk about as belonging work. Belonging work is a remedy to extreme othering that we have happening right now and polarization around really escalating a sense of othering. When we think about othering, these are the processes we think about othering, and therefore the processes that TU is helping guide against and unwind. Within othering, we can think of violence, discrimination, segregation, the way citizenship is used as a means to other. All of these are the experiences that people witness, but very differently, obviously, particularly with opportunity hoarding. Everybody lives within the structures of wealth accumulation and wealth distribution, experiences that very differently in very profound ways. The same with all of these other dimensions of othering. And so this is the way in which we'll talk more about later, but the way in which TU attends to situatedness, and again, the very different experiences under the same systems that people would experience othering or experience a sense of entitlement and comfort within the current systems. If we can start thinking about indices of othering and belonging. The Institute puts out an inclusiveness index every year, the state and national level. Within belonging, we're thinking specifically about the questions around power and the way power can be changed and has to be changed if we want to start thinking about a society that's focused on belonging. An expanded sense of who is cared for. All of these structures we live in, how do those structures express care? To whom is that expanded? And then also a responsibility for participating in change. And that includes or should include many people who currently are not engaged in that. So it's not simply a responsibility for people already engaged in equity work, but expanding the sense of responsibility for that work. We emphasize that othering is structural, systemic, and institutional. We can talk later, if necessary, about what those three different things are. But roughly, they mean structural change in the language that we talk about equity. Structures and policies aren't just there in the background, but they're very new. They're doing a lot of work. They're maintaining systems of othering. They're creating it. They're deepening it. It's not that they just exist in the background and we need to change them. They are very active and they are expressed through policy and institutional practice, which means we can change them by changing policy. This is one of the visual metaphors we use to talk about targeted universalism. That top line of people is where we would like the goal to be, what we would like to see as outcomes and experiences of belonging. On the left, of course, structural barriers, systemic barriers. On the right, we see something that's very deliberate on our part is to say those red barriers aren't just changed or flipped, but there's new structures and systems that are created. So in the struggles that we have within targeted universalism, we're addressing the fact that, first of all, many different types of barriers, many different experiences of those barriers, and the need to not just tweak those, but to really actively, affirmatively build new ones. The other important point is that when we're talking about belonging, we're talking about something that's useful to think of as very different from diversity, different from inclusion, and really this would emphasize the experience and questions around power that come to us when we think both about targeted universalism as a practice and then belonging as an ultimate aspiration. This is visual images I'm sure many of us have seen before, but targeted universalism draws out some details, really careful details around attending to all of these, but again, says a sense of metaphor. So again, thinking about redesigning structures, so it's not an individual problem, it's not people at different heights, it's actually a structural phenomena. And there's different situations that structures create for people. So again, these images are useful, but mostly to talk about some of the concepts that we have differentiated through talking about TU. TU, I'll switch to saying TU instead of targeted universalism, it's a mouthful. So when we talk about TU, we really emphasize, again, if structures create othering that we experience, we can change them. We cannot change towards belonging unless we have a deep engagement with situatedness or the way people experience those same structures. So going back to the earlier experience of othering, the structure of othering around structures around wealth, what determines wealth and wealth distribution, the systems around that. People are situated vastly different ways, different experiences relative to the way structures distribute wealth. That's a fundamental consideration of TU. And the other fundamental consideration of TU is that the ongoing assessment of the design of a strategy, the ongoing assessment of where we want to be, is situated on measuring outcomes. Are we getting to where we want to see? Are we working our way towards that? And then disaggregating that according to different groups that started off in a position that was not desirable, was not fair. We'll talk about an example to really explain what that looks like within a program. Some of the differences we draw out between programs that are specifically targeted and then versions of what we describe as TU. Sometimes targeted programs will focus on groups farther off and groups that are often excluded. Sometimes targeted programs move beyond expressions of equity. Both of those are really positive progressions according to looking at belonging. Sometimes a targeted program might look exclusively at disparities and the effort to close those disparities. Through TU, and outcomes that we would look for within effective TU programs would be that there's not disparities, that there would be fair outcomes for all groups. But if you focus exclusively on disparities, there's a limit to what people can aspire to have, partially because you're measuring them through data. If we're thinking about the racial wealth gap within the white group, often the goal of closing the gap. There's white groups, Bill Gates is thrown in with the same group of white folks as white folks in Appalachia. Often, if you start to disaggregate those groups, which a lot of equity projects do, a lot of targeted programs take that into account. But it's easy to think of that white group as being the aspiration of wealth, rather than thinking about a fair outcome for wealth that would apply and lift up many groups, including those who are farther off. Sometimes that would focus on an individual as being the cause and distracts attention away from structures. And then some of the mind science around focusing on a disparity is that it can, for folks who are new to the cause of equity, it can sometimes reify stereotypes and deepen inequalities when you think about the language wrapped around disparities. We can talk more about that. But then looking at TU, executed to its fullest extent, we can think about this as being a way to operationalize belonging, to expand power through the process of talking about TU, through identifying the universal goal, depends on including a much greater expression of power across groups, mainly focused on including groups that are far off and traditionally excluded. There's also a focus on using data to identify different groups early in the process, to look at where different groups are positioned, but also a big emphasis in using data to track outcomes, which again is the reason we're here to talk about equity, is to improve those outcomes. But often there's a focus on inputs being the measure. Sometimes that has to be where programs start, but the ongoing assessment has to be on outcomes, not just on tracking the inputs. When TU is in process, again, to its most radical implementation, we start seeing power shared. So in articulating the universal goal, it's co-created. It's an expression of belonging where power is extended to many groups, the expression of power with. Therefore, the goal becomes something that is really a shared interest for many groups. It's a approach that when you're talking about a goal that's shared, it can promote bridging, again, between groups that are very disaggregated in the discussion through data and through care and attention. And fundamentally, there's something that some thinkers in race have called the miner's canary, where birds that would go into the coal mines are more sensitive to bad air, contaminated air. Does that mean that we would just take the canary out of the coal mine? No, you pay attention to the structures and the environment, you clean the air. And that's a means to really direct attention again to groups that are suffering greater harms, listening to those groups, letting those groups set the priorities for policy. And then the way that TU is sometimes understood is that because it's a universal goal, there's lots of interest in supporting the goal. That's true. The reason we can be brought to the table to understand what that goal is by listening to the structural problems that we may not understand if we don't listen to the experience and attend to the structures that situate out groups farther off. There's a couple examples I wanted to go through to talk about some of these features of TU in a really practical, grounded way. So the first one is to talk about the Seattle Pedestrian Master Plan, which sounds very far off from what you all are working through. So I just wanted to flag that in advance. What I've done in talking about this is just talking about the distribution of resources and the question of what that looks like and how to plan around equity and the decisions of that. This is a good example of that. So the Pedestrian Master Plan from the part of local government, of course, is something that plans for the entire city and the future of the city. And these are some of the expressions that the city's master plan put out for that. There was a focus on equity that was occurring within the entire city, within the entire region, within the entire state. So that was happening within the context. The Seattle Master Plan followed up on a number of values. Only one of them was equity. But one of the central concerns and contributions to the field, as far as I'm concerned, is that they came up and organized their prioritization strategy exclusively on the question that there's limited funding to do what they were doing. They had the money from a tax levy. They needed to figure out what they were going to do with it. They said, with limited funding to improve sidewalks and crosswalks, which facilities should be built first? Where? How to make these decisions? There's a need. They could be spending this money everywhere in the city, but there's priorities. There's different situations that people have. So they started to say, we need a prioritization schedule for this. Within the spirit of TU, within the master plan, there's tons of goals articulated. So they stepped through a goal process, a policy process. All of it was based upon this prioritization methodology. They decided to track where investments would be made, allow that to be targeted in different areas across the city. So more resources are going to be put in different areas. And those decisions were set by 3 different data sets. So it's really data intensive process. It sounds like that's part of the question that you all are beginning to contemplate. One of these is called an equity map. So they looked at pedestrian demand. Where are the areas where there's more pedestrian activity? Where is there areas where there's more demand for more pedestrian infrastructure? And this was an equity map, which was one of 3. And this attended to where there were greater equity problems within transportation infrastructure, and also where folks of color and groups that had been less advantaged than the city on a number of indicators, where they were located. That produced a priority area map. So again, pedestrian master plan, sidewalks, not something you all are working on, but a really careful, deliberate attempt for them to say, how do we integrate equity within what it would require, which is an uneven distribution of resources. I heard that come up earlier in conversation. There's an understanding that resources are going to have to be distributed differently. And how do you do that within a distribution of public funds? Within the context of education, this is really a good example of what it means to focus on outcomes, not just or exclusively inputs. So there's an understanding clearly that inputs have to be a focus. And let me say here, a lot of the slides have a lot of text. It's intended for you all to have as a resource after the fact. And we'll just talk about some of the main points from them. So within the Kentucky plan, it was brought up through the Kentucky Supreme Court. This has happened in other states, but in Kentucky it was earlier, where there was a court case that said the education system in our state is not constitutional. There's a constitutional right to adequate education in our state constitution, and Kentucky's children are not getting an adequate system. But the court came out with a decision that said there's 2 phases in any reform. There's inputs process, and then an implementation process, and then an abuse process, shortcomings for that. So there were data needed at the beginning to make sure all of those inputs were happening. There was data needed to follow the process to make sure all of those inputs were in place. There's also, more fundamentally, a process of measuring outcomes. And then not just having those outcomes measured and knowing the data that you're going to gather, but how you're going to use that data. Often there's a focus just on gathering the right data. Equally important is how that data is going to be used. And there's a note here that to consider equity and adequacy, the right data strategy of outcomes will help anticipate early warning systems about what's not going right and have a program designed for that. Only if you're tracking outcomes as a primary source. Incomes inputs could still be happening, but they're just not adequate for reaching the outcomes you want. Within this outcomes approach to looking at education, there's also the only means to get there is looking at institutional change and institutionalizing new practices. And within the Kentucky example, it became a permanent feature of the education system. The redesign of specific institutions was occurring because of essentially an analysis that's exactly the same as TU. Attending to different power differentials was happening within Kentucky. Education, as you all know, is a very politicized part of where your kids go to school. The decisions around deep geographic segregation, all of these major contentious issues come into education. So within that debate in Kentucky, they were understanding that there's hot disagreement and debate around distribution of resources, and the understanding we referred to earlier that different needs are going to be greater or lesser needs for resources. So the way that they were getting around navigating that contentious issue was to talk about institutional change, to be talking about a shared goal, a shared aspiration, but then also not leaving it to that extent. TU wasn't just a goal to start talking about it in different language, but to follow through with institutional change that flowed from that. So they're talking about our children and our schools, our future, and an accomplishment that's within reach and is worth the effort. So having this movement building language and where more people are involved and have an interest in it. But to follow that up with a really clear structural explanation of why there's a need for different distribution of resources. The focus on structures is fundamental attention here. And this is another example of how that played out on the ground. There was a political definition of success. There was a really clear explanation, not just of what the goal would be, as in our schools, these shared aspirations, but then what success looked like, which was outcomes oriented, which then has implications for resources. So it still had a really clear implication, in this case, of funding formula within schools. But the assessment in the long term was focused on seeing the changes from an institutionalized change. So if you're interested in more resources, I know you all have seen some of these already shared with you. There's more things on our website now, some additional podcasts, some clips from talks. But I think it's really great to just sift a conversation and open it up for Carlise to share some of her expertise as well. So I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Thank you, Wendy. That was amazing and a lot to take in and digest. And I do have a couple of questions for both you and Carlise, but I want to see if I can manage in sort of a limited time just to see if there are any general questions from the work group before I have more pointed questions for the two of you. So anything from the work group? Carla, please.
Thanks, Karen. Wendy, thank you so much for that overview. It always is really, really helpful to hear some of the concrete examples. So 2 questions and 1 point. The point of addressing power differentials and new systems that are being created is really helpful. And I just want to emphasize that Carlise has presented an equity definition for us that really looks at outcomes and process and the importance of process to ensure that we're bringing in diversity of voice. So just really helpful to hear that emphasized here. And then 2 questions for you, and not sure if we'll be able to get to it today, but if we have any follow-up. We've been discussing outcomes a lot, and I wonder if in the Kentucky example, there are examples of teacher and child outcomes so that we can look at it within the work group and what that may look like, and other just examples of what that may look like. And then to the inputs that go into one looking at targeted universalism, if there's examples of the types of inputs that were essential, that really live into the targeted universalism model that we can just look at and think about as we're building out the single rate structure.
Yes, so in the slides that I'll share with you, there's more examples and also more information on Kentucky example. And as far as outcome measurements, there's a lot of examples of how that's happened and how that's practiced over time. And the other question, and I can share a little bit more with you on that topic based on your question. To differentiate outcomes from inputs, the Kentucky example was really instructive because it was a whole different way of thinking about the way states promise an education for all of the children living in the state. Because often there's an exclusive focus going into education reform to say we want equal funding for all the schools. And if that happens, the program is successful. So the Kentucky example happened years ago, but it was one of the first examples that said funding, huge issue. So as we're addressing outcomes for education reform, funding was always one of them. And then within the Kentucky example, they also decided that one of the initial measures would be the implementation of the processes and then some of the strategies around initial assessment. So those were all inputs that happened at the initial phase, because when you're initially trying something new, that's what happens. Like that's the only thing you can measure. Over time, because it happened a while back, they've started to look at outcomes and look at scholarly literature also on what impacts education outcomes. And some of it has been more or less successful in looking at it that way. And a lot of the research that came from that has been used to say, we need to do this differently. We need to add these considerations into the mix. So it's been used in a way to develop policy and to identify exactly what changes need to be made in that policy. So that's one of the main aspects of measuring outcomes, is to see if there's so many different structures. Once you start looking at a number of different groups, I've heard you all talk about rural students and parents and households, students who live closer, students with different learning abilities, different students with language access. Once you start looking at many different groups, there's going to be many different strategies that need to happen immediately, sooner than later, because a lot of these students have urgent needs. And so looking at their outcomes over time is ambitious and complicated, but absolutely necessary to assess all of those strategies that will be implemented over time.
Thank you, Wendy. Carla, thank you for those questions. I think it's a good segue to Wendy and Carlise, while we still have you, and to ask two fundamental questions, I think, in about the next 15 minutes before we have to move on to our next segment. Again, this will be a continuous conversation, so it doesn't all have to happen here. But I'm just going to put into chat the two questions for the two of you. So from each of you, your thoughts on, again, building on what was just talked about, what considerations you think need to be given to establishing a base rate as we talk about equities, we talk about belonging. And then secondly, what are examples of costs that may be different when addressing equity? So just putting them out there, but maybe taking the first question first, and maybe Carlise, to give Wendy just a breath, maybe I'll turn to you first with your thoughts on this question one.
Sure. And if it's okay, I'll probably just focus on the second question because I
Sure.
shared some examples of how costs might differ in addressing equity in the slides that I shared.
Oh.
And so there are a lot of considerations, but if I were to sort of prioritize ones to share on the call, I think one would obviously be the costs associated in supporting the workforce. Like in studies that we've done, it's the most major cost for programs. It's where we've seen persistent inequities that have, particularly with COVID, that have been exacerbated to where now it's the point, it's, we hear from states, even when they increase compensation, they still cannot recruit the people that they need. And I think it gets all of the things that were coming, that came up before about how do we value it and uplift all of the work that people have done for so long, and really thinking about that and how we structure and how we talk about this new rate structure moving forward. And then the second consideration I would sort of say is that in thinking about the base rate, thinking about how that relates to the system overall. I know we're focusing very closely on rates for subsidized care, but we also know a lot of families that qualify for subsidized care don't receive it, or those families that may need it. And so I think you want to be also mindful in creating this base rate. And I guess kind of in Wendy's comment, like how does that affect the overall whole system, right? Like thinking about it within the subsidy system, but also thinking about it within the whole as well, because we know that these programs are not operating in isolation. And I think those would be the two things kind of considering the base rate. And they're more contextual probably just in terms of areas and then the system as a whole. But my slides before, I really thinking about like direct costs, materials, facilities that have been well documented that are challenges for providers to really be able to upgrade and improve their programs currently because of current compensation, and then also geographic differences, ages of children, different types of care that children need, the ability to bring in specialists are ways that additional costs that work care might vary. So I'll share those as my initial thoughts.
Thank you, Carlise. Really appreciate that. And Wendy's was that you, Wendy?
Oh, I just unmuted sometimes. In the new Zoom world, that's kind of like hand up sometimes.
So to you as well, and maybe you could let us know sort of which question you're responding to, just so everyone's tracking.
Yeah, I think I think the one that's in the background of both of these, I'll speak to that, which isn't a good answer to your question about one or two. It's one of the first points that Carlise had on her slide presentation, is that there's a difference between thinking about the price and the cost within a rate system. Thinking about the price really primes an analysis and implications for design around a willingness to pay structure, around the way it's difficult to consider costs that are not associated with supply and demand, which indicates kind of a universal rate structure. This comes up a lot in water systems, for example, like to consider it's the same rate for everybody, regardless of your ability to pay versus your willingness to pay. And I think that whole cluster of issues comes up when you talk about pricing, because it's a traditional way to think about economic pricing for same value add to families, therefore the same price. Thinking about cost enables the access to start thinking about all of these different social contexts that impact the cost that families experience, that are sometimes unquantifiable for economists, and how you add those into a rate. And those are all of those additional contexts with different costs that Carlise just mentioned around the different care needs, geography, all of these different experiences that happen within a cost structure. So being able to think about that flat base rate, but then add in and think about these costs that are more difficult to quantify, but much more necessary to think about a fair outcome for families in that sense. And then to add to that, an analysis about these, how these would really change systems and structures and institutions around it. So it's not just an effort to calculate a rate, but to have within the process of the state apparatus, within the Department of Education, within the different segments and offices within that department, how can you change institutional practice to instill that? So it's not a time-limited effort. It doesn't just respond to one commission, but something that can change the entire practice around how funds are distributed in the long term.
Thank you. That is, and again, just, really reinforcing, I think, a lot of what you were saying in terms of it's both the cost or rate structure and the practices around it. And there are so many systems and practices in place around each of these things, so sort of dismantling them and rebuilding them in a way that is about belonging is, I guess, one of my learnings from you today. I also want to just look to the work group. I saw Eric Sonnenfeld. Thank you. It looks like you responded sort of with some of your thoughts to questions 1 and 2. And I want, if you just want to take a moment to elaborate on your thoughts.
Thank you. They're in the chat, but I think what Wendy hinted on with kind of water services, I keep hammering away at this. Early education, childcare, whatever you want to call it, is infrastructure, like it or not. We are not looking at it as infrastructure. It's a need that everybody needs, but nobody can afford individually. So how do we affect a system to fund that? And when you bring in the thing about, well, like a water system, everybody needs it. There's a flat rate that everybody needs to pay. There's a reason for that, because there's a base cost that needs to be covered. If there's a better way to do that, I'm all ears. However, all of our infrastructure nationwide is funded by a minimum cost basis: roads, bridges, tunnels, rapid transit, because it's a necessity that nobody really can afford on their own. So how do we deal with that? Early education, childcare is a classic market cost failure. Something nobody can afford, even through subsidies. And subsidy market then impacts the private pay market, which then suppresses the wages and benefits that the participants who are providing those services are trying to achieve. So how do we get out of this box? And I think what we're trying to get to is whatever we come up with base is, will our policymakers actually support it? Because in the end, if they don't support it with money, we've wasted all of our time. Because without money, no system can survive. And I'll get off my soapbox.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate very much your input. Okay, Janelle, I want to turn to you for any reflections, but also, of course, to keep us moving too. We have still a great deal to cover before we're finished today.
Yeah, I think that it's probably good to build off of Eric's comment to say, I don't think any of us would be spending the time here if we didn't believe this was connected to decisions of policies that are about the fiscal aspects of the system. And so I think I really want to appreciate Wendy and Carlise for giving of their expertise to help us think about what are structures and how the structures that we have had in place have resulted, there's a saying that you're perfectly engineered to get the results you have. And I think what their comments help frame is we've made some engineering choices. It's not just funding choices, but the engineering choices that have led to funding being the way it is. And so if we want to change funding, not only do we need to see the ways that revenue come with that, but we need to have the structures that deliver it. So I feel like this has been exactly the kind of work that we're talking about, which is how do we draw attention to what structures do to bring forward equity, to do it in a way that allow us to say we're addressing targeted universalism, addressing those furthest from opportunity, and that this group, for your various perspectives, are helping bring forward that it's inclusive of creating a process that is addressing the breadth of needs that exist in the field, which are quite diverse. So this is not to suggest that it's it's all about everything being the same. It's actually, to Carlisa's point, in the definition of equity, it's both equity and how we look at the outcomes. And that's inclusive of our providers, our workforce, and our children, and in the way we do this process. So I want to thank Wendy, thank Carlise very much for joining us and lending your expertise. This has been incredibly helpful. Wendy had some additions to her slides. So just want everyone to know we will be posting Wendy's. She warned us this would happen, that she'd like have the deck done and then have some flashes of inspiration. So we told her that would be fine if she could provide us the slides. So we'll make sure those get posted. We'll send an alert out and you'll see a version 2 of the deck available as soon as possible. So thank you both. Appreciate your time. You're welcome to stay. But what we'd like to do now is we're joined again by our partners at P5 as experts that are conducting the independent research that will be informative to the alternative methodology. This feels like the right place to turn to them to take over the discussion, to talk about, let's say, more of the nuts and bolts and that get us into base rate. And so I'd like to turn over to Gina. Thanks for joining us, and all yours.
Hi, everyone. Good to be with you again. Thanks, Janelle. We are going to jump in on some of those mechanisms for understanding cost and then having a cost model that will allow you to use cost to set rates for childcare providers. As you all know, that's what we're doing with you on behalf of Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies. That is what we're doing with California. Before we get into some of the meat of thinking about a base rate and then talking about alternative methodology a little bit more, I did want to highlight that one of the things that we know from a cost-based approach to a system is that the input and engagement of providers and programs that are serving children is of most critical importance to this process. It will be sort of a wholesale switch in how the California early care and education system functions. It's not just the survey that's live right now or the group interviews and discussions that we're scheduling all around the state with programs and providers, but they are very important at this particular point in time. So if you have not had a chance to push the survey out through your community or your stakeholder and constituent bodies, we really encourage you to. There's a slide with the link and the link to the website and all that. You're going to have that in the deck. You're going to see it on the screen, but you're also going to have it in the deck that comes out, and we can email that out again for anyone that maybe the email was back in early May and you might have lost sight of it. So we want to make sure that you are the ambassadors for how important provider and program input is in the cost model development process, because this is where we really start to change so that providers and programs in childcare and early care and ed don't feel like the system is sort of happening to them, but they are actually part of it and driving it. So very much the same things we have heard from providers already during today's call, as well as other programs that support providers. So that's embedded into the approach that we use to building a cost model. So I had to take a couple of minutes and make sure that that is on everyone's radar. We are on a super aggressive timeline to have the cost model done. So survey completion and providers participating in input giving sessions between now and the few weeks into June is really, really important in order to have provider voice be involved. And I see Simon's taking care of accurate links in the chat. So anything coming out of the chat,
matters for it. So, but the new link is in there.
Okay, great. All right, so let's jump into content a little bit. We have been talking about base rate quite a bit today, and of course, across the last couple meetings that we have had. And one of the things that as we're building a cost model for California, right, we're listening to all of these conversations and really trying to pull them together into the frame that will drive the cost model so that you'd be able to make selections about what your base is, that all of the options are in the cost model, that it functions in a way that allows you to make these sorts of selections. One of the things, so some of this content for the most part, honestly, is not new. It's sort of things we've been talking about all the months that we've been together. We're starting to bring it together into the draft of that cost model. But there was also an opportunity today to look at the concept of base rate by 2 of the states that have used cost of care or alternative methodology to set their publicly funded childcare rates. So we want to talk about that a little bit. These are just examples of how others approached it. We want to make sure, especially as you think about the discussions that you've already had today, the good information that Carlise led us through in thinking about equity, and we really see equity as a significant cost driver, that you see these just as jumping off points and examples of what another state did, not what California has to do. So that's an important piece, because these first two states that did this were at the beginning of a movement to cost driving publicly funded rates instead of market or tuition driving it. And they maybe aren't as far along as they want to be either in making those sorts of leaps to what they want their system to look like in the future. And so we want to acknowledge that as we look at those together. Just one quick reminder for folks in case there's anybody that hasn't seen us on the work group meetings and other statewide meetings before. This process is funded by private foundations supporting the work in the state of California. It is a partnership with the state partners as well as the Joint Labor Management Commission. So that's why we are here at the work group meetings working with you, because it's a critical partnership with you as well as a statewide work group. So I just want to sort of ground us in how this particular modeling being done by Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies is supported within the state of California. And in interest of full introductions, Simon Workman is joining me today, who's co-lead of Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies, as is Katie Kenyon. Let's talk base rates. As I mentioned, some of the stuff, you've totally seen these slides. I think I put 2 slides together in order to sort of move through it a little bit quicker. We know when we think about base, we have to meet licensing. Licensing is the minimum requirement for operating an early care and education program in any state. And so, of course, we have to embed that into how the base rate gets costed out. We know that includes health and safety standards. There may be health and safety standards that are sort of even a little bit more stringent than licensing that we find in certain regional locations. We look into those sorts of things. This is sort of a perfect example of that licensing can be a floor. It does not have to be the only thing that drives your base rate. And that's where things like thinking about compensation that is better than current wages can be a part of your base rate. And we're going to see that when we look to what has been done in a couple of the other states. It's also an opportunity that you can embed discretionary benefits. Discretionary benefits are not required by licensing, certainly. There may be some things required by employment law. Some states have a minimum number of days of paid time off for employees in the state. And so we follow those sorts of laws as well when we think about what are sort of the requirements that have to be in a base. But those are also things that can be put in a base even if they're not part of state employment law. And so we see that too in the examples that we're going to look at. But we also have the opportunity with the base to think about some of those other equity cost drivers that are really of critical importance to thinking about how do we pay for what is currently happening. So kind of hearkening back to that earlier discussion that was had around the idea that providers are not made whole for what they're currently doing, and that we need to be careful that we don't only build a cost-based approach to covering providers if more things are added to what they're expected to do, right? We have to be very cautious about that. That feeling of concern that we've heard through this work group and we've heard throughout California is we hear it across the country when we work with states and communities, that providers are accustomed to experiencing more money only if much more regulation and much more things required of them. And yet the more money doesn't keep up with what they were already being asked to do and doesn't keep up with the new things that they're being asked to do. A cost-based structure and really understanding what the costs are associated with the work, whether or not it's currently required, is a critical piece of moving away from that dynamic where regulations or expectations keep going up and the money goes up, but it only goes up a little and it doesn't go up enough to really keep pace with it. And so that's an important piece of thinking about enhancements. Then enhancements get added on and they also are costed out to really understand what it takes to deliver them. So when we think kind of deeper about what we may be picking from in the world of enhancements, and some of these things are sort of the same ideas that Carlise was raising around equity cost drivers, we just sort of build them out. And again, this isn't a new slide. These are all of the different variables that are embedded in any good comprehensive cost model. And then you as a state are determining sort of what are all the different points of selection and which scenario do you run when you're making that. If we just talk about base today, when you're making that decision around what does base include, you are making selections in the model to run the base. And then you can also run other levels too. You can run levels beyond the base, of course. So that sort of gives you that again, that snapshot of how the cost model functions, since it is a live functioning tool and something that you have available to you in an ongoing way in your work. So that's why I'm going pretty quick on this one, because this isn't new stuff, all of these different elements. What I want to pivot to now is to show you how in the 2 states that have used alternative methodology using a cost model and continue to use their cost model to set their publicly funded childcare rates, how they approach their base in their first pass at approaching their base. So this slide's new. There's a lot on this slide. We're going to talk it through sort of from top to bottom. You also are getting it as part of your materials. And pretty soon you're going to have a slide similar to it where California is the column, because this is the process of these are the discussions that we're having, is starting to put this information into the cell around what base is in order for that to be how the model functions and or to be one of the many selection points that are available in your cost model. So what I think is always helpful and something that we always have to make sure folks are sort of all on the same page around is that you do have to, in the cost model, make certain decisions about how the program functions or the program characteristics. So that first row is just sort of just the basic facts. So in both instances, we are talking about cost models that were ran serving children from birth to school aged. And so birth being defined as whatever licensing standards were in the state. They are running full day, full year care models, early care and education or care models. So this is not the specifics of a part day program or a preschool only program, school year only program. So just to be clear, these models can do those things, but this is specific to the base rate for that full year care example. It does include, of course, all mandatory employer taxes and any sort of laws that folks have to meet, like coverage for breaks for your employees. What you see then following over along this idea of program characteristics is the size of the program, because that's a determination that you have to make when you're running the cost model. There are different costs if you run a program with only 2 classrooms, which would be very hard to serve all children from birth to school age if you only had 2 classrooms, because licensing usually doesn't allow that many kids of different ages to be in the same room. But you see where I'm headed, that we have to follow sort of what is the most common size that occurs in a state. And in the case of New Mexico, at meeting licensing, that's 79 children in a center and 6 or 12 children in a family childcare, depending on whether it's licensed for small or large. In the District of Columbia, a little bit smaller center to serve all birth to school age. Their most commonly occurring size is 64 children in the center, but same numbers for small or large child development homes. And that's the term that they use for their family child cares, is child development homes. So those are real specific things to those individual states. In this particular base rate, ratio and group size is just meeting licensing standards. So I didn't put all of that here. Of course, we have all that detail in their cost estimation report and in the actual frame that drives their cost model. And you can see how in the case of New Mexico, their ratio and group size actually improves at other levels within their cost model. In the case of the District of Columbia, they have pretty high ratios, small group size at licensing, and they don't change it at any level from there on forward. They made it consistent across all of their levels when they think about the idea of quality. But in this case, for their base licensing, meeting licensing is the ratio and group size. Then we move on to, they had to make decisions in their base around compensation. In the case of New Mexico, so starting with the first column, there is a $12.10 minimum hourly. There's no employee in the model that is below that $12.10. There are employees that are higher than it. As you can see, the teacher owner salary is higher than the $12.10 minimum. That was the highest minimum wage in the state. So here's a place where they made a judgment call. This was not New Mexico at the time. This was not New Mexico's statewide minimum wage. This was the highest minimum wage in a region of the state. And so they pinned their minimum wage in their model to the highest minimum wage that was in the state. This is obviously something that they will keep up with the model. And I make a point about the point in time because their minimum wage has already gone up. The model was built at the end of 20 into 21, and minimum wage has already increased. So you can see how the model is truly a sort of evolving and always has to be changed and enhanced by the input of providers. In the case of the District of Columbia, this is actually their third time using a cost model to set childcare subsidy funded childcare rates, and they are using $15.20 as their base minimum hourly, which is also equivalent to the District of Columbia's minimum wage and their living wage. They've always had something in the district for the last 6 years or so that was the difference between minimum wage that was available versus the concept of what the living wage needed to be in the district. So now those two things match up, and so that's what's embedded in their model. Previously, they weren't always able to achieve that, but with this third iteration, they were able to achieve embedding that higher living wage, as well as then what happens to match with the minimum wage. Then you see, we just kind of look right underneath there for both. What I shared on this slide, there are salary points for other positions, but in the interest of sort of snapshot and the position that is sort of the most commonly occurring across both centers and family childcares is the salary point for the teacher/owner provider. Both of these models, and this is again, is an equity cost driver and a judgment call, include not just salaries for teachers and centers, but they include a salary and how the cost model functions for the FCC owner, which you all know. You spend a lot of time talking to Simon and Katie and I. We know family childcare pretty well. We work a lot with you. We know that family child providers don't necessarily take a salary. They take what's left at the end of the year. But that is sort of how business operates, which is different than thinking about how do we understand the actual cost of delivering family childcare. And not having a salary for the owner provider devalues what the actual cost of doing the work is. And we find across the country owners that are making sometimes as little as $2 or $3 an hour for the hours that they work to run their business. And so as part of thinking about public funding, investing in family childcare, these models do include a salary. Now, how the salary gets paid to the owner is on the owner to think about how they use that as part of their business model. It's that in the cost model, there is an expense for it. There's also an expense for all of the associated mandatory taxes and discretionary benefits that are for the owner provider as well. So we really sort of treat it as a position that needs to be funded in order to understand what family childcare actually costs to operate in your state, or in these two states in particular. So then moving on to another area of that is more than what you would expect out of just what licensing requires of a base rate is discretionary benefits. And you see in both instances, both of these states have retained a line item or a sort of a bucket of expenses for discretionary benefits. Those are the $2 amounts and one is right under 5,000 and one's right at 5,000. And I think the District of Columbia said, let's round it to 5,000, right? To stay with like an even dollar amount. So that is typically for health insurance or retirement or other sorts of life insurance. I mean, there's a variety of things this can go to. The model is not saying what that amount goes to. The model instead is saying that this is a value that there is in the rate of what it costs to serve a child in center or family childcare or FFN as well. We acknowledge that there is the need for discretionary benefits for the individuals that work in those programs. Same thing with the paid time off days. 20 days of paid time off, usually split between sick and vacation in both of the models. In the case of New Mexico, they around the exact same time passed a state law that there was a minimum, I believe, of 10 days of paid time off by all employers. So this exceeds that, but it already was built into the model, the feeling that it was important. And that is for every full-time position that how the model actually functions. So if you raise the number of children, you'll have more full-time positions in order to meet ratio and group size. So those are, again, things that are not about sort of just that minimum requirement to meet licensing, but is also about what are the sort of values or those equity cost drivers that we want to build into when we think about our programs and how they actually operate. All right, I better keep my eye on the time, huh, Janelle? So I'll move a little bit quicker into professional development supports. In both of these states, the minimum for training is not particularly robust. So you see training hours of 24 per FTE for centers in New Mexico, 12 hours annually for family childcare, whether it's the owner or any staff that work in the program with the owner. And then in the case of DC, 40 hours annually across centers or family childcare, child development homes. Neither state, in making this their base, made a put hours into planning time. And this is one of those places where it's really important for us to be thinking about what what works for California, not necessarily how other states have done it. Planning time is not a requirement in either of their states' licensing standards. They have planning time as a selection point in their model, and they do use it to think about the cost of delivering the care with planning time, but they did not select planning time as part of costing out their base rate. So that's something I think that we really need to be thoughtful about, because we know that planning time is one of those ways that we allow for teachers and family childcare owners to have time during the day, because planning time translates into substitute or floater or assistant, extra staff on hand to actually allow teachers and family childcare owners to spend time preparing for curriculum with children, possibly doing paperwork, doing grocery shopping in the case of family childcare during their work hours, versus it always being on personal time in the evenings and the weekends. Planning time is one of the biggest places that we can right size that issue around the fact that in all instances in early care and education, people reflect working 70 and 80 hours a week to actually be able to serve children for 40 hours because there's so much else that they have to do the job. Planning time is a way to really support us to get at that. So I want to highlight that while that is not in the base of these two states, that is, I think, something we should be really thoughtful and intentional about the decision for California. Then we think it's also really important to make sure that we don't leap over the fact that all base rate calculation has to include, of course, all the other expenses to run a program. It's not just about the classroom ratio, group size, and teachers and their compensation. There has to be a staffing pattern of the non-teaching personnel. And there is, in all states, some requirements around a director and an on-site director, so we follow that. But we also then work with the data collection, and this is where the input from providers can be really critically important to really understand what do you need in the case of that one full-time on-site director, that it's very hard to run a program with that. And so in the case of New Mexico, they have a full-time director, assistant director, and an administrative assistant in this base rate. And in the case of DC, director, receptionist, and janitor, full-time, and a half-time receptionist for this many children. In all instances, again, as the number of children go up, these things all go up as well. So we're just talking about this particular number of children for these salary positions, or having these expenses of salaries in the model. The base rate includes all things related to non-personnel. So I think that's an important piece is we all need to hold on to, is that when we talk about base rate isn't only factored on salaries of teaching staff. It includes all the expenses of running a childcare program, whatever setting you're running it at, which includes things like materials and supplies, occupancy, the cost of program administration, which may include other things like an audit or paying for have someone do your taxes. All of those sorts of other non-personnel are also included in the calculation of a base rate. In the case of New Mexico, they also included transportation. So that's again, not a requirement of licensing, but it was something that they heard from providers was a critical cost and needed to be included at the base in order to be able to move children, particularly between school-aged and after-school time care settings. So that was one of the big drivers of that. Last two areas, starting with the operating reserve. I know this is something you've heard Simon and I speak about before, that all of our models allow for the idea that none of our businesses should be operating without any operating reserve. I think COVID has shown how tenuous the situation has been for childcare programs. If we didn't know it before COVID, which I know many of us did, but it really demonstrates that not having anything in reserve makes it very hard when you hit a rough patch. And so we build in a percentage of the total expense that goes into operating, and then it is the option of the state whether or not they use that as part of their base rate calculation. In the case of, I've been working with DC for over 6 years now, and we always look at it with the operating reserve at 3 or 5%, and they almost always end up dialing it back. They are paying at 100% of the cost for every single type of care. So they have achieved that. It does not include any operating reserve. New Mexico is not paying at 100% of the cost for every single type of setting or every single age of child, but their rates do include a 5% of the total expense going to operating reserve. And again, no one's telling you have to put it into operating, but it's part of understanding the cost of serving a child is having these sort of best practices around how a program functions. And then the other piece that we wanted to include, because It's not in the actual base rate that comes out of the cost model, but it is included in how the New Mexico system functions, and they're going to be rolling it into their next iteration of the cost model. Is they in particular have compensation enhancements that go directly to staff. They refer to them as pre-K parity and bilingual stipends. Eligible staff at the base and any other level within their cost model, but starting at the base, receive these stipends directly. And they have some criteria around, it's not criteria in the sort of what we were talking about earlier that Mari raised, concern around that there'll be like another certificate, another requirement put on staff. It's really a much simpler eligibility requirement, and then the staff receive those stipends directly for filling that criteria. So we wanted to include that because that too is not a requirement of licensing. It's not a requirement of any of the current program standards, and since it's not being delivered directly through the cost model, but it's eligible to programs at the base, it sort of demonstrates how they're using another funding stream and layering on to the base through that vehicle. And we thought it was important. And then the District of Columbia, just in the early 22, passed, there was legislation passed and funded to move to parity with the public schools for all positions within their childcare cost model, as well as all programs within their early childhood system. And so they're working actually on, obviously, raising the amount in the childcare cost model is easy. We already had parity as one of the options they could select, but they're actually working on implementing that and getting people to pay parity, because they've got to get them to where they're paying everybody at parity. And then the new rates will maintain that going forward. So they're working on that implementation, and that is irrespective of what. So that starts at the base for everyone. All right, I'm going to take a quick pause. See if there's questions or thoughts. We're very cautious about the fact that other states are just other states. They're just examples. And if nothing else, they sort of hopefully help us to think about the frame of where you're headed in some of the base decision making. And there's been several different things that have been brought up as far as core ideas of what needs to be in the base. Hopefully this also helps you to see how we translate that into the cost model. Sort of everything that you bring up, we find a way to translate it into an expense in the cost model.
So Gina, I'm seeing a few comments. One is around treatment around regional cost differences. So Simon responded to Eric's question that they're not adjusted in New Mexico or DC, and DC certainly because it's a city. So any advice or examples given what we see in California regarding regional differences and how that might be factored in here?
We've actually done it within California, within one of your biggest counties. So we have some experience with the regional, and part of it stems from data collection and understanding the differences in expenses. But there's a really big consideration when it comes to thinking about that idea of equity, and particularly around compensation, is in all states that have regions have to grapple with this is, are they going to continue with the salary varying hugely across the regions of the state, even though the individuals are doing the same work? That's one of the biggest decision points that states have to grapple with. And really, when it comes to regional, we may see some variances in occupancy across regions, but the biggest thing that's currently driving all the cost of childcare is salary and compensation. And that's one of the reasons New Mexico was pretty eager to not add a regional variation, because they really felt they should be valuing the work and paying that across all their programs. And so this was not the point where they'd move to regional. They really felt like this was the point where they would actually move to more equity for doing the work with children across the state.
And then there's another comment or question from Robin around DC's model and moving to parity. And does that include benefits as well? So is it just compensation-based salary, or does it also include parity with what I guess I'm assuming it's the type of benefits available?
Yeah. So because they already have discretionary benefits and paid time off in the model, they are further along with benefits parity than if you're starting brand new on building a cost model, right? they have an analysis sort of how far those benefits are from benefits that are offered by the public school system. And I have to double check whether or not the current funding of the legislation includes just pay or if it also includes discretionary benefits. I'm not 100% positive if what has been funded at this point includes both. It is ultimately their goal for it to include both. And again, they are in better shape in both states because they are actually requiring discretionary benefits, which is not typical in any early care and ed setting.
I think Robin has her hand raised, so probably some point of clarification from Robin.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is really helpful when we're thinking about California and we're thinking about parity with school districts benefits. We really want to think about the health benefits and the retirement. Because that's really what's one of the things that's lacking with early childhood and with all of the majority of funding now being directed to TK teachers. So a lot of supports out there now for our implementation of TK, and now with a waiver for our CSPP teachers who will now qualify as a TK teacher if they enroll in a credential program. So they only have to have a bachelor's and have a permit, not only. So most of our teachers do have that. But if tomorrow they decide to enroll in a credential program, they qualify as a TK teacher. And so we're about to lose our CSPP workforce. So we're looking at not just parity with salaries, but with benefits so that we can be competitive.
So I'm going to ask Gina, do you mind, I'm mindful of the time here. So I know you have more to share, and it would be great to be able to cover alternative methodology, and we can come back to these base rate variables as we close out the conversation and feedback today.
Yep. So let's talk just quickly about alternative methodology. I think one thing that's really important for us all to sort of hold on to as part of your process is that what you're doing right now with the building of a cost model and working through these types of variables and the provider data collection, as well as all of the input sessions, are actually critical features of moving to an alternative methodology for rate setting. So this is, it's not as if, as I move to a different shade of color here in the slide deck, that we're talking about something that you have to start fresh sometime in the future in order to do alternative methodology. And we work with a number of states right now that are taking a similar approach where they are doing the work of building their cost model, and then we'll be pursuing the alternative methodology approval from the feds for how they use their childcare funding. So I want to highlight that this is not a separate process. This is, you're actually laying the foundation and doing a lot of the heavy lifting for alternative methodology right now as part of the process. But what we thought would be helpful is to give a little bit more of in coverage of the concept of alternative methodology. Most of these probably won't be new slides either, because they've been presented sort of in the early days as we talked about why cost model, in order to help support an understanding of the fact that this is allowed as part of how you can set rates. And so this is actually sort of direct information from the Child Care and Development Fund, which is CCDF there, abbreviated on the slide, the Child Care and Development Fund regulations or guidance to states. States are required to assess the cost. It actually uses the term cost, even though most states use market rate, which we all well know is not cost. But we already know that. We are moving to cost, so we're going to put that bit of framing on the part of the feds behind us. And that part of that is that information has to be used to inform rates that are set for subsidized childcare, which is your federal source of funding. The Child Care and Development Fund dollars come into the state of California, and then you use it in part to pay for subsidizing childcare, early care, and education settings. You do have a fair amount of sort of latitude in how you go about doing this process. There are two paths to go as far as the kind of big buckets of understanding the work. As Carlise mentioned, that she began with doing the market rate in California, along with pretty much every other state in the country until District of Columbia and New Mexico, the two columns we were just looking at, moved to using an alternative methodology. prior to that, every state in the country was using this first blue bullet, a statistically valid and reliable survey of market rates, which are tuition that is charged of families. It does include things like variation in that tuition by geographic area, type of provider, family child care center, the age of the child that's being served, right? All of those things vary. We know that within market rates, and they do within cost of care too. We know these things, right? That is what most folks are most familiar with, and that was what was part of the federal regulation, was to use the market rate survey. In 2016, with the full reauthorization of the Child Care Development Fund language, it was included that you could use an alternative methodology, and that alternative methodology could include cost estimation model or a cost study, which we're going to talk a little bit more about here in a second. States are required to seek approval for an alternative methodology, and as part of that approval is they have to outline how their approach will meet some of the federal expectations of alternative methodology. Sort of an interesting thing, because alternative methodology alone doesn't really mean anything, but when you kind of put it against this language, it's an alternative to using the market rate, in essence, is what we're saying. It's a different approach than using a market rate. And in most places, it's a cost-based approach. There's really no other way to sort of look at an alternative than moving to a cost-based approach, which is exactly where you're headed as a state. So, as I mentioned before, you can use either a results of a cost study or a cost estimation model. This too is not new information. It's something that we've sort of talked a lot about, is the idea that a cost study is a point in time. A cost study answers questions gathered from providers on their current costs, and it's in that moment in time. We actually do, and right now we're doing it with California, sort of a version of a cost study by doing all the provider data collection and doing input sessions with providers on the cost model, what their current reality is, what they need to be paying, what they need as far as assistance, and what they need their staffing pattern to look like. That is all helping us to build that cost estimation model, which then becomes actually a functioning tool that isn't just a point in time. It can function over multiple years. You update the data that underlies how the cost model functions, and it always then stays current. And it also allows you to be doing more thinking about where are you headed as a system, not just where are we right now. And that's where some of that piece of really moving to true cost, what it actually costs to do the work, not just what it costs right now, because we know that providers' budgets are so suppressed by their current revenue that's coming in, whether it's from families or the subsidy program. I wanted to share a couple other elements of alternative methodology from how the federal regulations talk about it, is then because some of these are really important to thinking about the methodology that Prenatal to 5 Fiscal Strategies is using with California. We do have a pretty simple one-pager that has this exact information in it that we will share after the meeting. It's in the slides too, but you'll have it in both places. So if you want to use that sort of what is alternative methodology one-pager, might be something that you'll be able to use in some of your education in your communities and constituents as well. But we've talked a lot and always do about how important it is that we're engaging childcare constituent in the work, the providers themselves, that we understand the work of providing the cost of providing the care at different levels of quality, as well as the resources that are needed for a provider to remain financially solvent, which speaks some to the true cost, not just the actual cost right now. And so that's why we're asking those questions of providers. And we, of course, this is where there's elements of alternative methodology that aren't that different than the market rate, in that you have to look at the type of program, the size of the program, the ages of the children served, because serving infants costs more than serving preschoolers, right? All of those features are still analyzed as part of using a cost-based approach under alternative methodology, the same way you would under a market rate. But the basis of the information is on the actual provider cost, not on what they're able to charge families. That's the big switch that we're making here. And so one of the other things that we just wanted to highlight then is how you move to alternative methodology and how you're getting it done. And probably this will sound really familiar, because this is pretty much exactly what we are doing with you. This is the process that we have laid out and that we are engaged in, from the constituent engagement and community conversations to that cost study piece of it that I mentioned. That then is moving into the modeling. And then we use together decisions on using that model, things like what is the base, what goes into the base in order to set rates, right? Rate setting is the last piece of the process that all of this sort of builds you to being able to do that, having a tool that answers all the questions that you want it to answer to support you in rate setting. And this piece, I know you've seen this slide with this baby on it a million times, so I'm not going to spend any time here, but we do like to put this one here as well, because you see these bullets here of our approach to cost estimation modeling mirroring exactly what I sort of just went through that the Fed regulations have in it. So again, just sort of reinforces that you are involved in a process that meets the federal regulations now, and it will be sort of on your timeline to seek that approval to then use your tool and actually turn to using alternative methodology. It doesn't mean you can't set rates based on cost before you get the federal approval, but you are on a path for the federal approval as well. All right, Janelle, do you want to take it away back to base? As I mentioned to everybody in the deck, survey is live. We are signing up people for input sessions, so join us. Tell us more about your reality as providers and programs across the communities. There will be lots of opportunities, but we want to make sure folks have access to this too.
Yeah, thank you, Gina. It's amazing how time flies here when we're going through so much. So I guess before I turn us back over to wrapping up with some comments about the base, are there any questions or comments that haven't been shared yet for Gina, Simon, or Katie? Okay, well, I think a big takeaway is let's get the survey. The more complete it is, the better the information we'll have as we move forward. So I'm going to make an attempt here, because I do want to allow time for public comment, to call out some things that have been part of today's discussion with regard to base rate. And I think I'm going to go back to, there's clearly this move, this shift that we want to make to a cost-driven model versus the price-based model is this group is in strong agreement. And from that, I think we've surfaced today that our current standards have requirements with them that really relate to these cost drivers. So some of the choices we'll have to make are, do we keep all the dots? Do we take some away? And some of the areas that you've called out with wanting to see there being some adjustment in the way we treat or what we recognize as costs is a couple of columns that we don't presently have in our requirements that we will need to think about how we address in terms of costs. So some of those are inclusion and how do we treat children with disabilities? What are the costs that we need to recognize and associate across our various types of programs and funding related to the needs of our dual language learners? There also is, I think, an open question, because we haven't seen this in the other cost models, which is, do we attend to regional cost differences? And so Gina's point was, well, in New Mexico, they chose not to because it's the same work, perhaps in different places. Some of the rationale of what we've had in our state presently is there are different labor market drivers and therefore reasons to have differentiation. And some of that has come up in prior conversations. So that's something we'll bring back to you, is do we want to persist with regional cost adjustments, or is it something that we go with a single factor and there are other things that account for adjustment? And then I think the critical piece here is the major cost driver is what we pay people. And so you saw Gina present some structures around what minimum standards may be in terms of building that up. I'd like to hold on any determination of what the right numbers are, because this group isn't trying to establish specific numbers. But I think if we have, and this is to some of what Wendy shared, is what are our targets? What are our goals? Are there some references that we'd like to see acknowledged in a structure that allows for there to be that noted? So just want to put a pin. You saw some of the words around parity, around targets. Like those are all things that we'll need to be looking at as we continue to have this discussion. So I think what I'd offer here is Are there any last comments around, one last thing too, the call out is the comment was made earlier around the way that we look at what's currently in the system. And let's make sure that as we move forward, we're paying for those things that we're saying are done. And as we build the system, let's make sure that it has the measurements or the tools so that we can understand where we need to, in the service of equity, pay for things as they are evidenced. So this is the point of some of our systems of what we measure may not be complete enough in order to make sure we give the right credits to compensate and or provide in the rates for things that go beyond our program standards. So I think this is a comment that has come up throughout our sessions is we have practices right now that are part of quality that are not recognized in current rates. So how, as we're moving to a cost-driven model, do we make sure that we're capturing all those practices? And this is to Carlisa's point, so that we can preserve or hold in place that horizontal equity. So those that are doing the same receive the same. And I think some of the factors that you saw in Gina's table get to the vertical equity, where there are differences. And this, one of them that was called out is based on age. So the ratios are different and therefore you're seeing some differences, that being the vertical equity. So those are things that we now, I think, have some reference points that we can continue to look at. But before we close, any additional comments or requests that you have as we're preparing for the July meetings, which really will get, the June meetings, which will allow us to get even deeper, present some modeling of this, really discrete decision points for you with regard to single rate structure, getting into the connections between provider needs and child outcomes and how that connects to quality and connects then to structure. Those will be the things that we're addressing when we meet next on June 10th. And then building our way to July sessions where P5 will come back with cost examples because we'll have the survey to work with. So everything gets a bit more tangible as we get into July. But June being really, I think, important for us to address some of that structural piece, particularly I think Carlisa's questions that she posed are questions that we'll start to work on. How do we build back some specific examples for you in those decision points? So any comments here or requests?
And while you're pondering that, we will open the chat feature now because we have just a few minutes left for public comment, and then we'll take what verbal comment we can. But so any last piece of feedback? Okay, I think
we can go to chat.
Exactly. So thank you so much, everybody. We do want to open up public comment now. So the chat feature is now open. We'll also be taking verbal public comment. So please, if you'd like to speak verbally, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen. We'll give you 60 seconds if you could, or if you feel you can do it in less, even better, to make sure we can accommodate a few speakers today. Please state your full name and the organization you're affiliated with, if relevant. And with that, I'm going to move to Liz Scully to hear her comment.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I just wanted to thank the group for the conversation on equity. And I also wanted to thank the group for taking on this monumental task. It's definitely not easy. I just want to share a little bit about myself as we're talking about equity and base rates. And I wanted just to share my story with the group because I think it's really important as we're discussing this topic. I've been an early childhood educator and advocate for 25 years. I've worked in Head Start programs, centers, and as a private nanny. For the last 15 years, I've run a licensed family childcare. My family immigrated here to America when my mother was a school-age child. I didn't go to any formal childcare settings, and I went with my grandmother to work to clean houses in affluent neighborhoods. When I had my daughter, I decided to make a conscious choice to be a family childcare educator. And when I was deciding where I could live while being a family childcare educator, I took a look at the subsidy rates that the state offered. And I realized that if I wanted to provide care to the most needy children and families, that I would not be able to make the choice in which region I wanted to live, because of the low subsidy rates, would not cover the cost of me living in my chosen region. And so herein lies the fundamental challenge with the subsidy rate, when it's not a base rate that is a livable wage in any region when accepting subsidies. You know, this will continue to oppress family childcare educators by not allowing them to make the choice themselves as to what region they want to live in. And so I believe that the base rate should be a livable wage rate that will not oppress family childcare educators and allow them to make the choice for themselves where they would like to live and provide care. Until we do this, I believe that we will continue to perpetuate the inequalities and inequities in the family childcare field. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Very much appreciate that, as well as the comments that are coming in through chat. And we'll be keeping the chat open for a few minutes after the meeting ends, but looking that there are no other raised hands, Janelle, maybe just looking to you, Carla, anything you'd like to say before we adjourn?
Yeah, this was such an insightful conversation. Lots of gratitude to Carlise and the othering group joining us today. The idea of what equity looks like in this structure is really, really critical. And what we heard really clearly as we went through the next equity steps is one, the importance of data and knowing what's happening with opportunities for children, providers, families throughout the state. So we'll make sure that that's part of what comes back to the work group. The importance of base variables that actually address equity, and a lot of the work group has brought up inclusion issues, has brought up professional development, time for all our early care educators. And very clearly, the work group has talked about the importance of base variables, including all childcare settings. And those are really critical components within the equity discussions as we've elevated that will be something that is centered in whatever structure we present. There's a few other issues that have come up, and I really want to emphasize that the outline for the report you all received today, Janelle went over it at the beginning. We hope to have a first draft to the work group on June 3rd for you all to review. And the idea is to give us a long period of time to have a few drafts These drafts will belong to the work group. The ultimate recommendations are what you all are offering. So the supports of putting that report together and having you all review several drafts to make sure that we really capture the really complex issues that you're lifting up. So letting you know that by June 3rd, according to the timeline you saw, you should receive the very, very first draft, and we'll discuss it on June 10th to incorporate a lot of what you're saying. And then lastly, I'll share P5 has put out information about the survey. The survey is really, really critical because this is where we're collecting data of what many of you live and know already. But the idea of using this data and collecting information about true cost has been circulated. I think Deborah challenged Department of Social Services to get the survey out. So just wanted to share that you all should have received some of that information already, and the survey has been posted and shared with others in different work settings. So the importance of that data and lifting up some of those regional differences that we've discussed. But overall, just lots of gratitude for those of you that have been on this call, share your passion for this work. And we look forward to additional conversations on making sure that we add all the great suggestions that were offered today.
Thank you, Carla. All right, with that, I think we should let you go, and we hope to see you all on June 10th and be looking for information in the interim. Thank you all very much. Take care, be well.
I'll be leaving the webinar open, the chat open for a couple of more minutes in case anyone has any last minute comments.
Thanks, Maya.
You're welcome. I'm going to end the webinar at this time. Thank you all for your participation.
Record.